This hearing will now come to order. Good morning and welcome to today's hearing. The title is ATSDR, Problems in the Past, Potential for the Future. The stated mission of the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, ATSDR, is to serve the public by using the best science, taking responsive public health actions, and providing trusted health information to prevent harmful exposures and disease-related exposures to toxic substances. The relatively obscure federal government agency first came to this subcommittee's attention a year or so ago as a result of ATSDR's health assessment for formaldehyde exposure by Katrina and Rita victims living in FEMA trailers. Government at all levels failed the victims of Katrina and Rita in many ways, but ATSDR's failure was perhaps the most unforgivable. ATSDR's health assessment certainly failed any test of scientific rigor, but ATSDR's failure was worse than just jackleg science. ATSDR's failure was a failure not just of the head, but of the heart. FEMA requested the health assessment to use in litigation and requested that the assessment assume an exposure of less than 2 weeks, knowing that Katrina and Rita victims had already been exposed to formaldehyde fumes for more than a year and that there was no end in sight to their exposure. Stunningly, ATSDR obliged. Their report gave FEMA just what FEMA asked for. Let me repeat that to let it sink in. FEMA came to SDR and said, we've been sued. We need a health assessment for formaldehyde, exposure to formaldehyde fumes. The folks who have been exposed to those fumes have been exposed for more than a year already, and God only knows how long they'll be exposed into the future. But we want you to assume that they are exposed for less than 2 weeks. And ATSDR said, no problem. Okay, we can do that. Now, obviously I've had to shorten that story a little bit, but the facts that I've left out are not exculpatory. They are more damning still. It gets worse from there. FEMA touted the assessment to assure families living in the FEMA trailers that the formaldehyde fumes were nothing to worry about. Dr. Howard Frumkin, who is here today and will be a witness today, was then and is still the director of ATSDR. Dr. Frumkin held a dozen senior staff meetings on the formaldehyde issue over a 6-month period after ATSDR issued the report in February 2007. Only after unflattering scrutiny by congressional committees, including this subcommittee, did ATSDR correct the health assessment. Since then, this subcommittee has heard from many sources of other examples of jackleg science by ATSDR and a keenness to please industries and government agencies that prefer to minimize public health consequences of environmental exposures. Our sources have included outside scientists, residents of communities exposed to various chemicals, and ATSDR's own scientists. One ATSDR staff scientist told our subcommittee staff, it seems like the goal is to disprove the community's concerns rather than actually try to prove exposures. Today we will hear about a small number of the cases that have been called to our attention and about problems at ATSDR that date from the agency's creation. And then there is the question of what to do about ATSDR. When federal agencies fail in their mission, the problem is usually a lack of resources. There is no reason to believe that more funding or more staff for ATSDR would result in anything other than a greater volume of jackleg assessments saying not to worry. We hope that the Obama administration will take a hard look at ATSDR, and we may want to consider legislative fixes. First, there is a possibility of peer review, outside independent peer review. The statute now neither requires nor forbids ATSDR from getting an independent peer review, and in fact, ATSDR very rarely, if ever, gets a peer review. Most scientists see peer review as helpful, as constructive criticism. ATSDR, on the other hand, apparently sees opinions of outside scientists as unwelcome meddling. And as a result, according to the scientists we have talked to, the research design and methodology is often flawed, and the research is frequently not sound, accurate, or complete. Congress may well want to consider requiring peer review, at least in some circumstances, by legislation. It is hard to know, however, how Congress can require ATSDR's leadership to have the guts to resist political pressure and insist on scientific integrity. The American people deserve better, and so do the many scientists at ATSDR who have dedicated their lives to protecting the public's health and devoutly wish that ATSDR faithfully and effectively perform the agency's stated mission. I will now recognize Mr. Brown in a second, but first we will include the staff report that this subcommittee staff has prepared, will be included along with my statement in the record. Dr. Brown, the ranking member.
I thank the chairman. Good morning. I want to welcome the witnesses here today and thank the chairman for holding this hearing. I share the chairman's concern with public health and safety issues, not only as a legislator, but also as a physician and a scientist. Our constituents deserve to know whether their families are being exposed to harmful levels of toxic chemicals. As the chairman noted, ATSDR is no stranger to this committee. The subcommittee's previous inquiry into the health consultation report for FEMA regarding the formaldehyde in trailers and the agency's work regarding toxic releases into the Great Lakes regions pointed to weaknesses in ATSDR's scientific review process, as well as how they convey information to the public. Because of these concerns, ATSDR initiated several internal reviews of these efforts, and the committee asked GAO to review the agency's processes. Dr. Frumkin will update us on his agency's efforts today, but we'll have to wait for GAO's results for a few months. Until then, I hope the witnesses here today can help this committee and the general public better understand the agency's original mandate and how it has evolved since its inception, the public's expectations for the agency, and the effects of increasing number of petitions to the agencies. Understanding and communicating these fundamental points are the first steps in evaluating the effectiveness of ATSDR. While the work of the agency does what it does is critically important, it is also very difficult. Determining causation and making health risk determinations is not always black and white. Despite the complexity of their work, the public deserves to have an agency that they can trust. The issues that we discussed today are not simply academic. Much like the witnesses on the first panel today, many of my constituents turn to ATSDR for answers about the effects on their local environment and on their family's health. Recently, Jill McElhaney, a constituent of mine, contacted me regarding her experiences with ATSDR, the EPA, and the state of Georgia. The heartbreaking story of her son's battle with childhood leukemia and the possibility that chemicals from a nearby industrial facility could have influenced his condition is cause enough for all of us to take notice. I hope this hearing will help us shed light not only on how the agency can better protect public health and safety, but also how it can adapt to its evolving mission and the appropriateness of this evolution. Additionally, I hope the witnesses can help us understand how the agency can better coordinate with community organizations, other executive branch agencies, and state and local departments, health, as well as other government facilities on the state and local level. Aside from ensuring that science is always at the center of the agency's work, understanding expectations and effectively communicating with the public is key to making sure that ATSDR is an effective agency in the future. In closing, I want to thank our witnesses for appearing here today, as well as all the hard-working folks at ATSDR. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the rest of my time.
Thank you, and I look forward to working with Dr. Brown on this committee. I welcome his expertise, his scientific expertise, and do not, if I was able to get along with Mr. Sensenbrenner, I certainly think I can get along with Mr. Brown, Dr. Brown.
Well, I look forward to working with the chairman. There are some theoretical scientists on our scientific committee that don't think that physicians are scientists, but I will take exception to that because we do scientific theory, et cetera, and I appreciate the opportunity of working with the chairman.
As a recovering lawyer, I'm certainly in no position to sneer at your scientific credentials. I will certainly accept you as a scientist. I understand Mr. Wilson has no opening statement, but we will accept opening statements for the record without objection that may be included later. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first panel of witnesses. Dr. Salvador Mier is the former Director of Prevention for the Center for Disease Control and a local resident of Midlothian, Texas. Professor Randall Parrish is the head of the British Geological Survey's Natural Environmental Research Council's Isotope Geoscience Laboratories in Nottingham, England. I hope he doesn't repeat all of that at every cocktail party. He participated in an innovative study of community exposure to depleted uranium in Colony, New York. Dr. Jeffery Camplin, is the president of Camplin Environmental Services Incorporated, a safety and environmental consulting firm in Rosemont, Illinois, and is a licensed asbestos consultant for the Illinois Dunesland Preservation Society. Dr. Ronald Hoffman is the Albert A. and Vera G. List Professor of Medicine at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine, the Director of Myeloproliferative Disorders.
You need some help with that.
Perhaps Dr. Brown could introduce Dr. Hoffman. I think it's easier now. Program at the Tisch Cancer Institute at Mount Sinai and formerly the president of the American Society of Hematology. It is the practice of the subcommittee to take testimony under oath. Do any of you have any objection to being sworn in? Okay. We also provide that you may be represented by counsel, or any of you be represented, or any of you represented by counsel today. We ask you these questions to put you at ease. If you would now all rise and raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth? All right. Let the record reflect that each of the witnesses responded in the affirmative. You now have 5 minutes each for your spoken testimony. Your full written testimony will be included in the record of the hearing. When you complete your testimony, we will begin with questions, and each member will have 5 minutes to question the panel. Mr. Mier, please begin.
Thank you, Chairman Miller and Dr. Brown and other committee members. Because other Midlothian residents, Midlothian, Texas, were not able to be here today at this hearing, they asked me to bring a short video that depicts some of the animal and dog health issues that we've had concern with. And I would like to request your permission, sir, to show that brief video.
Thank you. I believe that we have talked about this at the staff level, but the video is only a little more than 3 minutes, 3.5 minutes.
3 minutes.
And what I would propose is to allow Mr. Mier to show the video and have that not counted against his 5 minutes for testimony. Without objection, Mr. Mier.
So did our pets, our animals, our neighbors, our relatives, and our friends in the area. And when you've lived here for 20 some odd years, you can tell a difference. On her side over here, you can see this indentation. There's an extra muscle that has developed there. You won't see that in a well cared for horse unless they're having difficulty breathing. And, you know, I spoke with the vet, and he said that he just doesn't see those lines on the abdomen unless it's a horse that they refer to as heavers, which they're having trouble breathing. People that have moved from the area, their horses were also experiencing symptoms like this and reproductive problems. The ones that have moved from the area, the horses don't have these symptoms anymore. The gentleman up the road, he was sick at the same time that his cow was. She just lost her equilibrium. It was difficult for her to get up and down. It progressively got much, much worse. She could not walk. She would fall. Something had affected her neurologically. It became apparent that she would never, ever recover. So we had her euthanized.
I am Deborah Marford, a professional dog breeder in Midlothian. Hair analysis for me and several of my animals at different stages of life are basically the same. We all are suffering from chronic heavy metals such as mercury, arsenic, lead, chromium, nickel, cadmium, and selenium. These heavy metals have weakened all organs and immune systems to allow parasites such as Demodex and yeast infections to take over. We all have extremely high levels of aluminum. Aluminum, lead, and mercury go to the brain and nervous system, thereby poisoning every organ in the body. By being a great binder, it depletes the system of calcium, magnesium, sodium, and potassium, which is needed for energy in life's process. There have been years that I have lost 75% of new litters. Sick animals removed from the property show significant sign of improvement. I have seen significant improvement in my animals since the 4 wet kills incinerating hazardous waste has temporarily been idle. Over the years, I have seen a wide range of birth defects, deformed limbs, deformed faces, small growths, intestines outside of the body cavity, blindness, no testicles, and no visible urinary outlets. My health problems consist of profound fatigue, depression, and granulomatous disease. My doctor and vet advises me in abandoning my property.
Our community is on a treadmill to nowhere. Our human and animal health issues have been festering for years. Our environmental agency declares industrial emissions are harmless, and our health agency uses this as a refuge to look no further. In my 40-year public health career, mostly with CDC, I never experienced such a lack of will to determine sources of illnesses. There was never a quarrel about finding a cause caused by a bacteria or a virus, but when a potential source involves an industry, dynamics change drastically. For answers, I looked toward my former employer, CDC. Thus, we petitioned ATSDR for a public health assessment in July 2005. But instead of getting the trusted health information promised by ATSDR in their mission statement, we ended up further from the truth. ATSDR has demonstrated they are not committed to the responsibilities inherent in their mission statement, or they are not willing to overcome external pressures and act independently to abide by the commitments of this mission statement. Midlothian, Texas is a small town with one of the largest steel mills in the U.S. and the highest concentration of cement manufacturing in the nation, with 3 plants, one of which is the largest in the United States. These industries, in addition to traditional fuel and other refuse, incinerate whole and shredded tires and hazardous waste, tons of hazardous waste, in kilns never designed for burning hazardous waste. Daily, tons of toxic emissions pour out of 10 cement kilns and 2 steel industry stacks. Using an EPA screening model in 2005 toxic release inventory, USA Today, in collaboration with researchers and scientists at the University of Massachusetts, Johns Hopkins, and the University of Maryland, ranked all schools in Midlothian in the upper 3rd percentile of the nation's most toxic schools. 2 ranked in the 1st percentile and 2 ranked in the 3rd. After hazardous waste became a fuel source in Midlothian in the 1980s, physicians began seeing more patients complaining of upper respiratory problems. Ranchers reported breeding problems, aborted fetuses, and deformed offspring in both horses and cattle. A statistically significant cluster of Down syndrome babies was identified in 1995. A study of respiratory illnesses in Midlothian performed by the University of Texas surfaced a 35% higher incidence of respiratory problems in Midlothian as compared to a control group. A study in 2005 found the prevalence of overall birth defects for Midlothian was 1.5 times that of Texas, and the prevalence of hypospadias and epispadias, congenital defects in which the urinary outlet opens above or below the penis or on the perineum, was 3.5 times that of the state of Texas. A local dog breeder experiences in her animals large numbers of immune deficiency illnesses, deformed offspring, litters born dead, cancers, and failure to thrive. Questions about a suspect air monitoring system were dismissed. What about all of the empirical evidence that was surfacing? No answers came. When ATSDR agreed to do the assessment, they said they would ask the state health department to help. Once the state became involved, the assessment morphed into a consultation, and the responsibility for making the decision was relegated to the state. The same individuals who had for years declared our environment posed no health problems were going to look at it once more. Furthermore, the decision was to be based on state monitoring data, the same questionable data. By morphing the assessment to a consultation and using the same data, the same folk could pretend not to see, totally ignore health problems and empirical evidence by using the same familiar refuge. Air monitoring does not support anyone being sick. ATSDR never intended to be an active participant with this consultation. We were never going to get off that treadmill, at least not with ATSDR's help. The consultation was finally released for public comment December 11, 2007. Scientists who reviewed it made the following comments. Dr. Stuart Batterman, University of Michigan, states, "The health consultation is biased. It contains overarching statements that discount all indications that emissions from local industry and environmental conditions might or do pose a health concern in our community. It should not be issued by ATSDR." Dr. Peter DeFure of Virginia Commonwealth University states, ATSDR's classification of this site as an indeterminate public health hazard is in direct contradiction with the data the agency presents in the report. Throughout the document, ATSDR attempts to marginalize or disregard data that indicate that compounds produce human health risk. ATSDR has more than enough data to classify the site as a public health hazard. Dr. Neil Carman, a scientist who formerly worked at the Texas State Environmental Agency, states, it fails to seriously acknowledge the numerous gaps in the ambient air monitoring in the Midlothian area. We naively expected an objective and scientific evaluation that would provide trusted health information. We were wrong. Instead, ATSDR abdicated its responsibilities to the state and never questioned the science behind the collection of the data and the reliability for making public health determinations. If ATSDR does not have commitment or capacity to objectively temper and counter external forces that dissuade them from their mission to serve the public by using the best science and providing trusted health information, then ATSDR needs to get out of the public health and consultation business. To maintain the status quo will only continue to risk the public health of many U.S. communities.
Thank you, Mr. Mier. Professor Parrish.
It's a privilege to be here, and I thank you for the opportunity. It's an interesting contrast to my day job as a research professor at University of Leicester, and I run a large environmental isotope analysis facility in the UK. My role here today is really just to provide you with my perspective on the Colony, New York, that is a suburb of Albany, New York health consultation as a result of my conducting research there on depleted uranium pollution at the site as part of a broader investigation of depleted uranium and health issues. What I want to do is really just emphasize some of the most relevant, compelling facts and issues about the health consultation. As illustrated on the side panels, depleted uranium munitions and other uranium manufactured items were made at the National Lead Industries plant in Colony, New York from 1958 to 1984, when the plant was closed due to the company's environmental negligence from release of excessive radioactive uranium oxide aerosols on the surrounding community, and the community can be seen to surround the remediated plant. In about the mid-1980s, the federal government accepted responsibility for this site, and up to 2006 has spent approximately $200 million remediating the site. In response to the community concerns expressed to the Army Corps of Engineers, the ATSDR concluded a health consultation in 2004, and its fundamental conclusion was that in the active years of emissions, these emissions endangered the local populations and workers' health by the risk of inhalation exposure to uranium oxide. On this conclusion, there is general broad agreement. With regards to the health consultation that ATSDR did at this site, let me just mention a few specific outcomes. You will recognize some themes here that are common to other health consultations. The agency decided not to conduct any new research as part of its health consultation and did not pursue any further environmental investigations or health surveillance activities. It misunderstood or was unaware of the analytical tools available at the time to identify the presence of depleted uranium in urine bioassays via isotope analysis. It concluded that the 20-year length of time from 1984 closure would make identification of any DU exposure, DU meaning depleted uranium, exposure impossible. It also concluded that it simply wasn't feasible or possible to identify the cohort of workers and residents with the highest exposure. It gave also incomplete and in part unbalanced descriptions of the relative health importance of the two exposure pathways, one being the relatively benign ingestion pathway, that is coming into contact with contaminated soil, and the other being the more insidious inhalation pathway, which has higher health risks associated with it. In short, the agency appeared to dismiss the viability of conducting any further health studies on the exposed population. Now, the difference in the colony situation with respect to some other sites where health consultations have taken place, and probably the reason I'm here, is that our research group has, so to speak, sort of picked up the pieces of the situation following the health consultation, and we've conducted some of the work that ATSDR could and should have done. For example, we determined the chemical form for some of the particulates and showed that it was the least soluble of all forms of uranium oxide. We also used a high sensitivity method for uranium isotope urine testing that we had previously developed in the UK, and we showed that depleted uranium could be identified in the urine of exposed individuals, and it can be quantified, even more than 20 years after these people were exposed. We extended substantially the existing 1980s vintage environmental surveys, and we worked in a collaborative fashion with the community to identify a portion of the historically exposed cohort. In short, we in part accomplished what ATSDR said was not possible, and we did this with very modest resources and actually at no expense to the U.S. taxpayer. This brings this whole issue into even sharper focus about the shortcomings of the health consultation. In a sort of taking a step back, there is a larger perspective about depleted uranium and health issues that relates to broader issues such as Gulf War illness that affects veterans, and the continued use of depleted uranium munitions by the U.S. military. ATSDR did not appear to recognize an opportunity at Colony to shed further light on these broader issues, the opportunity being to study long-term health consequences, if any, of exposure to inhaled depleted uranium oxides. The exposure to DU has been an ongoing issue in the media and government with respect to exposure of soldiers to this toxin and its health consequences, and the issue does not have sufficient study at present. A comprehensive study could have added new knowledge to help resolve this issue, and is therefore part of the government's duty of care to soldiers and veterans who have unselfishly served the nation. Considering the acknowledged risks to health at Colony that arose partly that were obvious in the first place but also confirmed by the health consultation, the lack of any resources devoted to targeted health studies at Colony when compared to the $200 million spent on remediation is, if one is being generous, grossly imbalanced, and if you're being shedding it in the worst light, you could say that this is somewhat immoral and perverse. Let me just conclude with a few general comments about ATSDR and perhaps the way forward. The ATSDR remit sets quite a high bar to reach. That is basically effectively protecting the health of the nation. This is a complicated and potentially very expensive challenge. The pattern of performance in recent years, as I have gathered simply from reading documents in the past few weeks and learning more about this committee, appears to suggest that this standard is not being achieved. So it seems to me there's two options. One is that we partly admit that some of this high bar, this high standard of performance may be unachievable, in which case, it should be redefined so that ATSDR can actually have realistic goals. Alternatively, if the remit of ATSDR is a valid, public service imperative, then it seems to me you have to do three things, and they have to be coordinated and done effectively together. The first is that the agency has got to have a strong vision. It has to have strong leadership, and especially it needs the commitment throughout the organization to its mission, and it has to basically embrace that ethos. The second point is that the agency needs to have the resources to pursue its investigations to their logical and defensible conclusions and be able to resist interference. Both of these two recommendations, it seems to me, are essential to restore the credibility of the agency. The third thing that needs to be done in concert with the rest is that the agency needs to find and implement a mechanism that effectively and defensibly prioritizes its investigations and resources so that it actually can deliver its remit. This external review prior to release of documents could form a component of that. This third one basically would allow the agency to maintain credibility once it establishes a renewed sort of presence for the future. So that's the end of my statement. I'll be glad to answer questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Parrish. Your use of the phrase immoral and perverse made me feel better about perhaps my opening statement being a bit harsh. And I do want to thank you for coming a considerable distance to come to this hearing today.
That's my pleasure.
We have been joined by the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall, do you have any statement?
Chairman Miller, thank you for having this and bringing these men before us here. I was particularly interested in Sal Meyer's testimony, his longtime service at the Centers of Disease Control. I listened to him, and you're welcome to come by my office and thank Dr. Brown. I appreciate it. I don't have any questions because I don't know what other questions you'll have, but I'll try to get back here and listen some to one of the other panels. But I thank you very much.
Thank you. You don't represent Midlothian, do you?
No, but the legislature's in session. You never know where you're going to be.
Right. Mr. Hall covering all bets. Mr. Camplin.
Good morning. I'd like to thank the subcommittee members and staff for holding such an important hearing on the lax behavior and misuse of science by ATSDR leadership and staff. My name is Jeffery Camplin. I'm president of Camplin Environmental Services, Inc., a safety and environmental consulting firm based in Rosemont, Illinois. My chosen research specialty is asbestos. I've been a volunteer for the Illinois Dunesland Preservation Society since 2003, investigating why ATSDR purposely downplays the chronic asbestos exposure of millions of Illinois citizens each year. My story begins in 1993 when I brought my wife and 3 kids to Illinois Beach State Park, located on the Illinois Lake Michigan shoreline north of Chicago. After building sand castles and burying each other in the sand, I heard my wife explain, "Look in the car. It's full of sand. It's in the kids' hair. It's in their ears. It's in their shoes. It's everywhere." Sand eventually ended up in our laundry room as well. Little did I know at the time that my wife, along with millions of other families, should have been saying, "Look at the asbestos contamination from the beaches. It's in our car. It's on our kids. It's in our home." I've been working for the last 6 years with Mr. Paul Koukouris, president of the Illinois Dunesland Preservation Society. Our research indicates that ATSDR has violated its mission to serve the public by purposely not using valid science, by not taking responsive public health actions, and by providing untrustworthy health information. Specifically, ATSDR has become a complacent agency, choosing to produce outdated, inferior work products when they know more valid science exists. When ATSDR's ethics and competence are challenged, a great wall of arrogance and denials appear from their leadership to strenuously fend off requests for accountability. ATSDR also takes advantage of the public's gullibility to trust an agency that is ethically bankrupt. The egotistical leadership and complacent culture at this once great agency needs a total overhaul. However, that's not enough. We are here today to demand accountability for the harm caused to public health by inexcusable and deliberate behavior of ATSDR staff in downplaying elevated levels of toxic microscopic asbestos along the entire Illinois Lake Michigan shoreline. Evidence demonstrates that US EPA and the state of Illinois, along with ATSDR, bungled the cleanup of an asbestos Superfund site at the south end of Illinois Beach State Park, allowing trillions of asbestos fibers to be released from an unfiltered pipe into Lake Michigan to this very day. Their incompetency also allowed large areas of asbestos-contaminated lake sediments to be dredged and dumped on and offshore at a heavily visited public beaches. Federal agencies and state of Illinois then generated rig data to conclude the massive asbestos contamination they created was not hazardous to the millions of citizens who frequent these areas. Illinois is well known for nurturing a culture of public officials with less than honest and ethical behavior. Illinois officials seized upon the opportunity presented by the complacent culture at ATSDR to protect their unethically symbiotic agendas. They obtained rubber-stamped approval of their intentionally flawed federal and state reports. In order to conceal the unethical behavior of their staff, ATSDR will tell you the science is still developing while they knowingly continue to use severely flawed and outdated asbestos risk assessments. What they don't tell you is the current science completely discredits and invalidates all of their past asbestos human health evaluations in Illinois, as well as hundreds of other sites throughout the nation. ATSDR stubbornly refuses to acknowledge this fact. Just this week, ATSDR arrogantly issued another health consultation which intentionally fails to warn the public about deadly microscopic amphibole minerals they found in beach sand and air. Instead, ATSDR recklessly continues to invite families to a shoreline chronically contaminated with asbestos. That is, as long as they don't touch the visible pieces of debris during their visit. Yet there's no recommendation to the public regarding the microscopic asbestos that gets on our kids, gets in our cars, gets in our homes, and ultimately enters our lungs. Maybe Dr. Frumpkin can explain his staff's findings that deceitfully conceal the hazard from the public. Another example of ATSDR's indiscretion include the review of one of their beach asbestos exposure results in 2006 that the EPA identified as potentially harmful to health. ATSDR dismissed the criticism by the US EPA, stating the beaches were safe anyway. The fraudulent findings of ATSDR create a welcome permission slip for the continuing dredging of toxic asbestos-contaminated sand in Illinois. Spreading the contaminated dredged material on the shoreline increases the risk of mesothelioma cancer rates in Lake and Cook counties along Lake Michigan that are already have elevated mesothelioma rates when compared to national averages. How high must the body count get before ATSDR admits there's a problem? In 2004, then Illinois State Senator Barack Obama best summed up our feelings when asked by a reporter about the asbestos contamination along the Illinois shoreline. Our current president said at the time, "We can't have our kids swimming in areas that might be contaminated with asbestos." And then he stated they should consider shutting down the asbestos-contaminated shoreline. Precautionary protections are necessary to address the continuing public health disaster and egregious violations of public trust from getting any worse. The first step is for ATSDR to acknowledge their past studies are flawed. Next, limit the public's exposure to asbestos-laden shoreline beaches until scientifically valid exposure assessments can be completed in an open, inclusive, and transparent manner. The final step is to hold all parties liable for their actions. ATSDR officials Mark Johnson, Jim Durant, John Wheeler, and Howard Frumpkin, along with state of Illinois and US EPA officials, must be held accountable for their egregious and potentially criminal behavior that was resulted in millions of innocent families being unwittingly exposed to deadly amphibole fibers. On behalf of the Illinois Dunes and Preservation Society and the citizens of Illinois, I want to thank you for this hearing.
My opening statement seems more and more temperate. Dr. Hoffman.
Thank you. For the last 30 years, my research and clinical practice have revolved around the investigation of a group of chronic blood disorders termed the myeloproliferative disorders, which include polycythemia vera, essential thrombocythemia, and primary myelofibrosis. These are serious disorders characterized by excessive production of red cells, platelets, and white blood cells, and are associated with excessive blood clotting, bleeding, and eventual evolution to acute leukemia. In 2005, a mutation in an intracellular kinase termed JAK2 was found to be present in patients with myeloproliferative disorders and was shown to play a role in the development of this particular group of disorders. The mutation allows blood cell production to occur in myeloproliferative disorders in the absence of signals provided by hormones that normally control blood cell production, leading to the production of too many red cells, white cells, or platelets in patients with these disorders. Most importantly for this discussion, the JAK2 V617F mutation has been shown to provide an almost foolproof means of diagnosing patients with myeloproliferative neoplasms, since it can be detected using molecular methods in over 95% of patients with polycythemia vera. Since there are numerous other causes of too many red cells or polycythemia other than this form of blood cancer, physicians frequently had great difficulty in making this diagnosis. With the advent of the molecular test for JAK2 V617F, the accuracy of definitively diagnosing this disorder has been greatly elevated. Although blood cells with JAK2 V617F are occasionally observed in patients with other kinds of blood cancers, it is rarely, if ever, observed in normal people. My first contact with the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry began in summer of 2006. Dr. Vince Seaman, an epidemiologist and toxicologist at ATSDR, first called me to ask me some questions about the nature of polycythemia vera and about the possibility of environmental insults increasing the incidence of this blood cancer. I was a bit skeptical about the significance of this polycythemia vera cluster that Dr. Seaman and his colleagues were then investigating in Carbon, Lucerne, and Schuylkill counties in eastern Pennsylvania in response to an invitation made by the Pennsylvania Department of Public Health. After a series of phone calls with Dr. Seaman, I gained a greater degree of comfort with these investigations, that this cluster was a potentially important from scientific point of view, and that it presented a possible public health danger to the citizens of the state of Pennsylvania. In the past, links between environmental exposures and clusters of polycythemia vera have not been well documented. In my discussions with Dr. Seaman, I emphasized the difficulty of making the clinical diagnosis of polycythemia vera, and that the newly described molecular assay would provide a simple, inexpensive means of making this diagnosis with certainty merely by testing blood drawn from the study subjects. Dr. Seaman agreed, and we set out to create a means of obtaining blood specimens for subjects who agreed to participate in the study. We proceeded with the JAK2 V61 testing due to my belief that these studies were the state-of-the-art in 2009, although there was initial pushback on the part of the agency. And I felt that it was important to do this test to confirm the diagnosis of polycythemia vera. By the end of 2007, these analyses had been completed, showing that about 53% of the subjects in the study area fulfilled both clinical and molecular diagnostic criteria of having this hematologic cancer. One patient had diagnostic features of polycythemia as determined by a committee of experts, but did not have the JAK2 mutation. The confirmed cases appeared to be clustered around numerous EPA Superfund sites and sites of waste coal power plants in the Tri-County area. Remarkably, to me at least, 4 of the reported cases of polycythemia vera were located along Ben Titus Road, a stretch of about 100 homes scattered along a 2-mile stretch. Each of these cases were confirmed to be JAK2 V617F positive, and therefore to indeed have polycythemia vera. Remarkably, the greatest number of cases of polycythemia vera were in the Tamaqua area, a sparsely populated area not in the area of greatest population density near Wilkes-Barre. With this data in hand, I and Dr. Seaman wrote an abstract in August 2007 for consideration for presentation at the 2007 meeting of the American Society of Hematology, to be held, ironically, in Atlanta, Georgia in December. Several conference calls were held with numerous members of the ATSDR staff who checked the data and went over the content of the abstract word by word and agreed with the data and conclusions of the abstract vocally during these numerous conversations. The abstract...
Dr. Hoffman, there is a 5-minute limitation. We are reasonably generous with it. Your whole written statement will be part of the record. Could you summarize in perhaps a paragraph?
Sure. The abstract eventually was accepted by the Society in November of that year, and it was accepted as an oral presentation. I then went on to create this presentation that was presented before the Society in December of 2007. A representative of the agency management team was to appear at the presentation, but at the last moment, although he was based in Atlanta, he refused to attend or wasn't able to attend. Several days prior to my presentation at Atlanta, the ATSDR announced to me, issued a press release stating that the abstract presented results that were premature and scientifically flawed. Medical colleagues in Hazleton called me to inform me of this disclaimer, and because the reports had appeared in the local press. I was, of course, shocked and was incredulous about the lack of forthrightness demonstrated to me by my presumed collaborators at ATSDR. After my arrival in Atlanta, I was contacted on cell phone on repeated occasions by officials of ATSDR requesting that I either withdraw the abstract entirely, state prior to my presentation that the agency disagreed with my conclusions, or present an abridged version of the data. I presented the abstract in its entirety, and it was well accepted by the audience at the American Society of Hematology. In order to obtain further peer review, we then went about, upon Dr. Seaman's return from a trip to Mozambique on ATSDR business, to submit this publication to a peer-reviewed journal. Prior to that submission, the agency insisted, independent of Dr. Seaman and myself, to perform further geospatial analyses, which, to a statistically significant point of view, confirmed the findings that were present in our abstract, showing that there was a higher incidence of polycythemia vera in this area, and that those cases were essentially around these areas of high toxic exposure. From my point of view, the mission of the agency is to generate and communicate credible scientific information about the relationship between hazardous substances and adverse events that affect human health, and to promote responsive public health actions. My experience was that in the case of polycythemia vera in eastern Pennsylvania was that the ATSR did not accomplish this goal, but only accomplished it eventually with relentless prodding to complete the needed investigations. My sense was that if the agency was left to themselves, they would have preferred to ignore the whole problem. ATSDR seemed to be committed to a course of ignoring and discrediting a mounting body of evidence which suggested the presence of a cluster of polycythemia vera patients in this Tri-County area. With the full publication of our paper in February of 2009, the agency really, as I think, greatly turned around and began to become much more serious about these investigations, and hopefully in the future we will be able to expand this area, which I think is of great interest. Thank you for your time.
I want to thank all the witnesses for your testimony and for appearing here today. We will now recognize each member present for 5 minutes of questioning. The chair now recognizes himself. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Dr. Hoffman, what do you have an impression, an opinion of what accounts for ATSDR's unwillingness to look at the data from the cancer cluster that you looked at? Do you think it's the leadership of ATSDR? Do you think it's the culture of ATSDR? Is there external pressure? Is there a reason that comes to your mind to explain their reluctance to acknowledge or find a chemical or environmental exposure may cause the cluster, the cancer cluster?
Well, first of all, I want to state that I think there's a number of very talented investigators there, and there's a very talented staff. So there's a lot of good folks there. My sense is that they felt that it was a futile effort since there were so many environmental toxins in that area, to essentially develop a one-to-one relationship between a particular environmental toxin and the development of polycythemia vera. That led to a sense of futility. What was articulated to me on numerous occasions was that even if we found out that the incidence of polycythemia vera was greatest in this area, what were we really going to do about it? Could we essentially define an additional, the known agent? That kind of thinking, or nihilism, I would call, is very foreign to me, because I'm used to, in the laboratory at least, solving or trying to attack very complex scientific problems. And I really thought that that attitude was pervasive, this feeling that one could not identify the toxic agent. And that led to, sort of snowballed into sort of talking away or speaking away or downplaying the significance of this cluster. I think what was also not perceived was the importance of the cluster. The importance of the cluster really went beyond just this particular area, because it linked very conclusively, especially with the sophisticated statistical analysis that I congratulate them on performing, which was very hard science, showing that it was highly unlikely that this was random. So what it really shows is that blood cancers in general could be related to environmental toxins. That's a very important question and an observation. The point is this a futile event? No, it's not a futile event making this association, because if we're aware of this, then we can essentially define the cause of this and hopefully develop chemopreventive agents to prevent additional patients from getting these cancers. So I think they were essentially frozen in time. And because of this sense of futility and perhaps sense of understanding the whole gamut of hematologic malignancies, they didn't really appreciate the importance of it.
Dr. Hoffman, you congratulate ATSDR on their statistical analysis and on the unlikely possibility that it would be random.
Right.
You have had your work peer reviewed. I assume you're competent to do peer review. Have you looked at enough of ATSDR's work to know how well it would fare in peer review?
Mr. Miller, I'm really not an epidemiologist. I'm a hematologist and a blood scientist. Prior to this interaction, which started in 2006, I had never heard of this agency, so I'm really incapable of evaluating their other work.
Do you think that there would be a value in requiring peer review for at least some of their assessments?
I felt, from my perspective, I wanted my work evaluated by outside reviewers. I wanted it evaluated and presented at a scientific meeting where I could get feedback from my peers. I also wanted it to go to a scientific journal where people could show me that I was wrong, because I was not really interested in presenting or publishing incorrect data. That's the way I was brought up scientifically. I think that's a healthy way to act within any kind of investigative effort if you're going to do real science.
Okay. Mr. Mier, you used to work for the CDC. You'd never heard of ATSDR, but you were inclined to assume that they would do reliable work. And that assumption you do not think is proved to be correct. What do you think is the reason for that? What do you think happened? Why do you think they do not do the job that you thought they would do?
I don't know if it's just the reluctance to go after an industry. I know that in Texas, at least my feeling is that there's not much balance between the need to prosper economically, to have jobs, and the need to care for public health and the environment. And in our state, my biggest concern is with the State Environmental Agency. And my biggest concern was why ATSDR did not closer evaluate the data that they were looking at upon which to make sweeping generalizations about public health. To me, the air monitoring system was so suspect. I'm not a scientist, but based on other scientists that I've dealt with have always told me that. And there's so much tinkering that can be done with the various aspects of the monitoring system. And why they would not not just ATSDR, but the state public health agency with which they have a cooperative agreement with in Texas, why they would not look at the empirical evidence. I always felt that the best biomonitors were the animals in our community, much better than any mechanical device that we could have. But why they would just not want to look at our animal issues as a potential for a sentinel for human health.
Okay, my time has expired, and I'll try to be reasonably indulgent with the other members as a result. Dr. Brown, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Miller. I appreciate it. We each have 5 minutes to ask questions, so I'm going to ask a pretty broad question of each of y'all, and so if you would, try to answer it within 30 seconds, and we'll go forward. If you were a dictator, how would you fix ATSDR? What would you do? Starting with Mr. Mier.
Boy, you know, to me it's a cultural thing. Someone needs to go in there to let them know that.
I'm sorry, Mr. Mier, your mic is not on. So
I'm sorry. Okay. There's nothing wrong in going after or looking at an illness closely when it might potentially be related to an industry. I think there's a tremendous reluctance to do that. I understand it's a very complicated science, but to run away from it and not look at strong empirical evidence, to me, I just can't understand that. When I was dealing with, in my own humble way, looking at viruses or bacterias and the issues that I dealt with when I worked with CDC, there was never any quarrel. But it's the dynamics change drastically when you point a finger at an industry.
Thank you, Mr. Mier. Again, we need to fix, if there's a problem, which obviously all y'all think there's a huge problem there, we're trying to look to try to find out, this is an investigation oversight committee. We need to have some, I'd like to hear some suggestions of how to fix the problem and not just wonder. So, Professor, do you have any suggestions of how we can fix this problem?
I mean, I think big organizations have inertia, and if you want to change them, I think the first thing I'd do if I was dictating would be I would clarify what the remit is. What is the mission of the agency, and what is its relationship to other public health agencies and states, for example? I know because ATSDR, it bumps up against these other things from time to time. So you need to clarify what your boundaries are, and then I think once you have that mission really clear, you have to recruit the leadership and the senior management team to implement the vision for the agency and make sure they have the resources so they can actually pursue that mission with vigor. That's what I do.
Mr. Camplin?
Two things. One, I would recommend that they open up the process a little bit more on the very front end so that there's a little bit more agreement and buy-in along the whole way, as well as having that third-party oversight, peer review oversight. We've requested that on numerous occasions, and it falls upon deaf ears. The other side of it is accountability. There are policies and procedures in place that they're supposed to be following, and there doesn't seem to be any kind of accountability. And I know in our case at the Illinois Beach State Park, we would love for this committee to request the FBI to meet with myself along with Mr. Paul Kakursa of the Illinois Dunesland Preservation Society so we can turn over evidence of what we believe is criminal activity as well.
Doctor, I'd love to talk to you about the JAK2 mutation and all the things as a fellow physician, but if you were a dictator, what would you do to fix this? And I certainly believe in peer review. As a physician, we look at those types of things, and I can congratulate you on your research into these blood diseases.
Well, I guess I'm a little bit more optimistic about this culture. I think there are, again, I will repeat, there are excellent people there. This is not a deficiency in the talent of the staff. I think what they really need to be is basically cut loose and be told to do good science and unrestricted science. I think the submission of work to peer-reviewed journals should be encouraged, because once that was accomplished and once the paper was accepted, everything turned around. And in fact, when the Pennsylvania Department of Health, when they finally saw our manuscript, were upset about some of the conclusions that were made, ATSDR, to their credit, actually said that they weren't going to change or deny anything because they had shown that it was correct and it was peer-reviewed. So from my perspective, going through this over a couple of years with them, I think they need consultants that have a lot of scientific information and can bring more to the table, and then they should be cut loose to essentially test whether these things are scientifically valid. If not, their resources will be depleted. They have to find out what's really, really important, and then they have to go after it as a scientific mission.
Thank you all, Chairman. I'm about out of time, and we're going to submit written questions for y'all to look at. I'm sure that look forward to the answers further.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. In the last Congress, Dana, Mr. Rohrbacher was a member of the committee, so everyone else's adherence to the 5 minutes rule looked pretty strict by comparison. But if everyone adheres to the 5 minutes rule, I'm going to have to change my own conduct. Mr. Grayson. Oh, I'm sorry. Ms. Dowkemper is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe one of the biggest roles of government is public safety. And each of you are from a different area of this country. I'm from Pennsylvania, where obviously Mr. Hoffman is from, but you're all from different parts of the country, and we're seeing the sort of a retelling of the story. Do any of you have other areas where you have talked with colleagues kind of dealing with the same type of issue in terms of the conduct of ATSDR? It's open to any of you. Have you?
I mean, I'll just say, first of all, I don't, because I live in the United Kingdom,
true.
so I'll drop out of this one.
I'll mention that, at least on the asbestos side of things, I've talked with many of the people over in Libby, Montana, where there's currently an investigation going on with W.R. Grace and their exposure to asbestos there. And to a person I've talked to, that they consider ATSDR and EPA more of the dark side or the evil side than the actual polluters, W.R. Grace themselves. They do not agree with their science, and they do not agree with the politics that are there as well.
Mr. Mier or Dr. Hoffman, have either one of you had any talk with other colleagues in other areas of the country who've had problems with this agency?
I've talked to a few in Louisiana and other parts of Texas, but frankly, my wife and I we're retired grandparents, and we've been so busy researching and addressing this issue that I haven't spent a lot of time talking to other people, except that when I felt that we were going to have the same people looking at it again in the same old way and not getting an objective new look at it, that's when I begged for help from scientists around the country that were familiar with these issues and had them review our draft consultation report.
And my other question to all four of you, I guess, is the people in the communities where you're dealing with. How much of this information has been put out to the general public? What is the reaction? Mr. Mier, you still live in Midlothian. I mean,
I tell you, this is a very sensitive issue in our community. When we're talking about potentially implicating 4 industries with as many employees and family members as are involved, it's a very sensitive issue, and so they're very defensive about pointing any fingers at any of the industries. So it's a very sensitive issue to discuss in our community, both at city government and even on the school board. So there are very few of us that are actually working on it and addressing it, and we're looked at in a very different negative light, I think, by a lot of people in the community, unfortunately. And our only concern, frankly, is our grandchildren and other children and children yet to be born in our community, and that's why we're looking at it. We're not satisfied with the answers that we're getting, and we think that there may be some problems, and we're not satisfied with the way it's been looked at so far.
thank you for your courage.
Each of the witnesses and all members could make a point of speaking to the microphone. Although we can hear you, there are others who are watching this on the internet, et cetera, and it's helpful for recording the hearing later.
Well, I'd like to make one point about that. Without a doubt, the public does give the agency a lot of credibility when they put any kind of a report out, and so there is a doubt when we challenge anything that they say, they tend to get the benefit of the doubt, and it isn't until we're able to prove motive, because that's what they would say, well, why would an agency like this, such a prominent agency, put out such faulty reports? And when we explain the motives, then it becomes very clear. But that's one of the problems in the community is they believe in these agencies. They believe in what this agency at least used to stand for.
Yes.
I mean, I could just say that in the situation of Colony, New York, the industry that did the polluting is long gone. So it's a legacy issue. And I think generally the health consultation done there added very little new knowledge. It caused a great deal of frustration in a way, because I think expectations were very high that this was going to add new insight, provide solutions and so forth, and it basically did none of those things. And so, you know, on the one hand, I know there are a lot of people in that area, in government industry, that basically would like the whole issue to sort of go away and be buried. But on the other hand, in particular, the research that we did certainly served to raise awareness of the issues, and you know, by undermining part of the methodology that ATSDR used in their health consultation, it has actually sort of, in a certain proportion of the community, provided a way forward, I think, for progress in the future that was otherwise completely stalled.
Thank you.
The gentlelady's time had only expired by a little bit. Mr. Bilbray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hoffman, I want to thank you for not just your testimony, but also highlighting again what that coal-fired power plants leave a legacy of destruction far beyond air pollution. And a sad state of affairs, if I may say it again, that while we talk about the executive branch not doing enough oversight here and not looking at this issue, at the same time, the legislative branch, this Congress, is still buying coal-fired electricity to power our lights overhead, and never pass up a chance to take a cheap shot. So I want to put out that, you know, clean coal is as logical as safe cigarettes. And thank you for bringing up that there is other issues. Mr. Camplin, your work with the asbestos problem on here, specifically this site, just for my own information, are we talking short fiber, long fiber, or is it a mixture of both at this site that you were working with?
It's not only a mixture of short and long fibers, but they're finding predominantly amphibole minerals, which are much, much more toxic. And that's even more disturbing because they put disclaimers in a lot of their reports saying, in fact, that their risk modeling may significantly underestimate these minerals that are there. So there is some debate on what type of asbestos is toxic. However, what they're finding on the beach, there is no debate about it. It's the most virulent amphibole forms of the mineral.
Yeah, in California ARB, we found there was a stink separation that has to be, you know, to really be precise on this. Of course, at the same time we were talking about that, our roads are paved with serpentine, which is all asbestos, and everybody drives down a back road and the Sierra Nevadas is being exposed.
Well, it's a state mineral of California.
Yeah, well, I guess it's appropriate with our air quality. But there are, traditionally with toxicology, there are two major measurements. One is level exposure and duration of exposure. And though asbestos is different because certain fibers, certain types, can lodge in the lungs and maintain there and continue to irritate and create the problem. Do you think that the agency might have been using, like your instance, the short duration of exposure as a justification to reduce the risk level from the toxicology point of view?
It's even more obvious than that. If you were going to test beach activities, I would ask maybe Dr. Frumkin why his team has never reviewed data from June, July, or early August, which we would consider the beach season, and why approximately 30 to 40% of the time that they do air monitoring, it happens to be either raining or it just did rain. So that alone, we think, skews the data tremendously. And then getting into their protocols themselves and the outdated risk models they use, that just complicates things even further.
Okay, well, coming from Southern California, my perception is always raining in your part of the world. So
it is.
That's the challenge that we get over there. You know, the Texas model, I guess, really kind of highlights, too, the fact that when we get into these groups, that somehow when we try to get this agency to straighten out, we're treating a symptom of a deeper problem, and that is places like Texas not having clean, inexpensive electricity. So we can stop drawing on these dirty, cheap sources that create the problem. But I appreciate all your testimony. Madam Chair, Mr. Chair, my biggest concern is that when we talk about public health protection, as the gentlelady said, and we say it's governments, I'd just like to remind all of us, as somebody who comes from a background of being the agency in the neighborhood, the front line of health protection is not those of us in the federal government. We're the last line of protection. The first line is the local community, the local environmental health department, the local air district. And one of the biggest things I want to do is make sure that the feds are there to support the local effort. We've seen with Katrina what happens when the locals wait for the feds to show up, as opposed you saw in San Diego during our fires. They kept saying FEMA did so well. It's only because the locals didn't wait for FEMA to do it. FEMA came in and helped. And one of the things I want to make sure that when we reform this approach, that it's one of coming in and helping the local community protect their own neighborhoods, as opposed to waiting for the feds. Because the biggest shock I had when I moved to out of San Diego to Washington, D.C. is I look around the environment in this community and the environmental health around this community, and let me assure you, I do not want my neighborhoods to be controlled by the people who are taking care of the environment in Washington, D.C. right now. And that is one of those things that I think all of us should work at, empowering the local community to address these issues. And hopefully we can use this review as a way of doing more of that. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Brobray. Mr. Grayson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the members of this panel and to highlight the failures of the ATSDR, but I'd like to talk about a different circumstance that's come up that I think further underlines the situation. That is the situation that I'm talking about regarding Vieques, which is an island off the coast of Puerto Rico. Vieques is a beautiful place. Its economy is based on fishing and tourism, and for 62 years it served as a military testing ground for the Navy. And now it's the subject of a great debate concerning the accuracy of ATSDR testing. The military used, among other weapons, chemicals such as napalm, Agent Orange, and depleted uranium in and around the waters of Vieques. In 2003, the Navy stopped that military testing, and the area has become a Superfund site because of the heavy presence of metals and toxins in the area. It's being cleaned up, but there's a lot of chemical residue that remains. There's dangerous levels of heavy metals and toxins that have shown up in the crabs, in the fish, in the goats, in the wild horses that roam the island, in the vegetation, and in the people who live there. The health statistics in Vieques show the consequence of those toxins. Compared to normal residents of Puerto Rico, residents of Vieques have a 269% increased chance of cancer and a 73% increased chance of heart disease and many other health problems. Infant mortality in most of Puerto Rico is decreasing, but in Vieques it's increasing, and it's been increasing since 1980. And a 2001 study looking at the hair of the residents in Vieques showed that 73% of these human beings were contaminated with aluminum, and 30% of the children under 10 years old showed toxic levels of mercury. One of my constituents, Ruben Ojeda, a former fisherman in the area, told me that almost every person that he knows in Vieques has cancer, or a family member who has cancer or other serious illness. Ruben fished while the Navy dropped bombs around him, and he suffers from heart and respiratory diseases as well as deafness. His mother has anemia, high blood pressure, and diabetes. His uncle died of cancer, and several of his fellow fishermen have also died of cancer at young ages. In other words, in Vieques, heavy metal poisons the land and the water, and the population carries that poison in its bloodstream. And there is no debate about this anymore. But somehow, when this agency, ATSDR, tested the area, it stated that the poisons in the fish and the crabs and the vegetation somehow pose no threat or no danger to the residents. This agency, which is supposed to protect our children from poisons at Superfund sites, actually wrote that it's safe to eat the seafood from the coastal waters and near shore lands,
and that residents have not been exposed to harmful levels of chemicals resulting from Navy training activities. These remarkable statements should not come as a surprise for anybody who actually knows this agency. It's famous for ignoring the dangers of formaldehyde in the trailers used by Katrina victims. And for that, the agency was publicly chided by its own chief toxicologist, who had been cut out of the loop after raising concerns about the scientific basis for the agency's analysis. In case after case documented in an excellent report put together by the Science Technology Oversight Investigation Subcommittee, this agency has trivialized health concerns and failed to stop the ingestion of poison and the spreading of cancer. In other words, Vieques is not an isolated incident. There is a problem of leadership, structure, and agency culture. And from its inception in the early 1980s, this agency has fought with bureaucratic rivals, shortchanged science and public health, and as a result, it's let children be poisoned. And this too should come to us as no surprise, because the Reagan administration, which oversaw the creation of this agency, never found an environmental protection that it did not try to dismantle. And despite that origin, there's good and conscientious employees within the agency, and I'm hopeful that we can work to restructure this agency so that its leadership is committed to protecting the public from harm. This should at very least start with the acknowledgement that its work in Vieques is flawed, and it should start with a commitment to reassess that site and take into account the various independent studies which show elevated health risks in the area. You know, we try so hard as members of Congress to improve people's lives, but when I look at what has happened at Vieques, and I see all the health problems that Navy testing there has caused, and the health problems that have been perpetuated by the failure of this agency to do anything about it, I'm reminded of the Hippocratic Oath. Maybe the first thing we should try to do as members of Congress is very simple. The first thing that the government should try to do is very simple. First, do no harm. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Grayson. Mr. Tonko is not a member of the subcommittee. He is a member of the full committee, and as a courtesy, the chair is happy to recognize Mr. Tonko for a round of questions. He does have a particular interest in this subject today.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for this very valuable hearing. And to the panelists, thank you for being here. I represent Colony, New York, via the 21st Congressional District in New York. And so my questions are directed towards Professor Parrish. Professor, so I can be perfectly clear on this issue, the ATSDR people, did they test at all? Did they use a certain method, or did they not test workers and residents?
They did not test.
So you were the only group that tested?
That's correct.
And when your system that you offered to ATSDR was exchanged with their people, information-wise?
I've had no contact at all with ATSDR.
None at all?
None at all.
So that do you know if anyone reviewed the system you used?
Well, our work first went through considerable peer review in the UK to do with interlaboratory comparisons and so forth, and that work was published in 2006. The method was developed in 2003, and it was applied to basically a very large cohort of UK Gulf War veterans in the period 2004 to 2006. So we tested hundreds of UK veterans for depleted uranium in their urine during that period of time. I mean, this is the whole reason I started working in Colony, is to pursue this topic that I got involved in the UK as a result of working with the government to test veterans of the first Gulf War. And what we found in that particular situation is we failed to find a single person who had a DU positive result. Everybody was normal. And this raised a really important question. The question really was, were the veterans of the 1991 conflict never exposed to DU in the battlefield, or were they actually exposed? Did they acquire harm, for example, but has it been too long a period of time since the testing in order to detect the signature? So the reason we went to Colony was to follow this issue until it logically was concluded. And the reason that Colony is important is that there is an undoubtedly a very significant exposure to a lot of people to the inhalation of depleted uranium oxides as arising because of the manufacturing of the plant. And so we knew there was an exposed population, so we went there to try to find out, can we see this signature in their urine, even after 20 years? And the answer was yes, we could.
Now, my question to you also, were there any opinions offered as to that method by professionals from ATSDR, formal or informal, that were exchanged with you?
No, because I've had no contact, none whatsoever.
So is there anything that we can do to go forward with the town of Colony? Should there be any concerns or fears at the town residents? There are some theories that as many as 2,000 homes, if not more. I hear many oftentimes quote 2,000 homes being in the area of the factory, and of course the factory workers. Should they still have concerns about depleted uranium?
Well, let me first say that, I'm not a medical doctor, so don't misconstrue my opinions here. But I suppose my general view is that the heaviest pollution took place in the 1970s and affected probably in the neighborhood of less than perhaps 1,000 people. And I'm sort of drawing a line around, perhaps 600 to 800 meters around the plant. But there were lots of houses, and the residential area is extensive. And sorry.
No, I was just going to ask, has the agency ever contacted you to discuss your findings?
No, they have not.
You think they were aware of your findings?
They are. I mean, I know that people have told me that there has been some contact with ATSDR about my paper, but they have not contacted me.
And should the agency go back to the area?
Well, I think somebody should go back. If it's the agency has got a different attitude, then they should go back and redo some of the work. And the things they need to do are to find the people who lived there and were most heavily exposed. Regardless of where they live now, they should need to find these people. Then they need to do basically a health kind of census. What is the state of health and death results, for example, in the area that is closest to the plant? If there is something untoward going on in terms of that, then they could institute a series of testing programs to find out whether depleted uranium, for example, could be a correlated feature to those health problems. So I think there is a way forward to do this whole program there.
Now, the agency claims that, in quotes, it serves the public by using the best science.
Yes.
Have they avoided the best science? Have they used the best science?
Well, I think my words were they either chose not to or were unaware of the analysis tools at the time they did their report in order to determine whether people had an exposure. This was possible then. It certainly is possible now. They concluded it wasn't possible.
And if we use, if they use if we use your base number of 1,000 for round terms,
okay,
is there an estimated cost that the agency should assume will be borne upon it?
I suppose I've been asked this question, and I would have thought that you could commit something like perhaps $1 million or something, and with that sort of money, you could undertake a census to find the individuals, look at their health and other death statistics, as well as conduct urinary tests for uranium isotope exposure on perhaps several hundred people. You could certainly go some distance to make progress towards the resolution of the issue.
As I understand it, the federal government spent nearly $200 million.
That's correct, on the cleanup.
On the cleanup. Is that cleanup sufficient, or do you have any sense professionally whether or not?
I think the Army Corps of Engineers did the cleanup. I think they did a good job. What they did is remediate the site so that it could then be turned over eventually for some other purpose. But the primary health danger that was at the site arose during the plant's original operation in the 1960s and 70s and early 80s. And so once the plant stopped operating, the immediate health risk, as I understand it, diminished considerably because emissions of depleted uranium oxide particulates that were inhalable then more or less ceased. And so the ongoing issues relate to sort of secondary ingestion of contaminated soil or perhaps resuspension of dust. But we have also found that there are high levels of settled dust in attics and basements and houses and so forth. And this may be an ongoing health issue. I don't know.
Just one quick final question. I appreciate your tolerance, Mr. Chair. But it's very important to this community and to the district. There were allegations that the company had bypassed smokestack filters.
Yes.
Do you have an opinion on that?
I have been told this is a fact, and I have no doubt that it is.
But obviously, it's an issue that still needs to be.
I think the is it New York Department of Environmental Conservation, I believe, they documented this at the time in the late 70s. So there was no doubt that this was taking place.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Tonko. You were still well short of Mr. Rohrabacher's territory. Dr. Brown, if you would give me the indulgence of just one last question, not a whole nother round, but Mr. Mier, Professor Parrish just discussed the willingness of ATSDR to contact him and talk to him. Has ATSDR looked at the animals that were in your film?
No, sir.
Have you asked them to?
Yes, we have. Yes, we have.
And what did they say?
Initially, the response was that it wasn't within their mandated domain. Afterwards, we were told that neither ATSDR nor the Texas Department of State Health Services had the expertise. And the latest communication was that the Texas Department of Health has contacted a couple of researchers at Texas A&M School of Veterinary Medicine who might be interested in pursuing it, but that first of all they have to write a proposal and then hopefully seek grant funds to do that.
I'm not sure that Mr. Mier is the best. If Mr. Mier is not a scientist, perhaps Dr. Hoffman is the best to direct this question to. Is there a recognized value in medical research that effects on animals are an indicator, sentinel, for effects on humans?
In certain situations there are. There's not necessarily 100% correlation between the effects on small animals and humans. But I mean, okay. You know, as was shown on that film, I think it is of concern. I mean, I have no idea what the incidence of similar abnormalities are in that area in Texas, but obviously that would be of more substantive data to examine.
It would get your attention.
It would, well, as it did in the area in Pennsylvania, yes.
Right. Thank you to all of the members of this panel for your testimony, for coming here, and for answering our questions as well. We will now take a fairly short break before the next panel. Thank you.
Nice job.
Sorry?
Did a very nice job.
Thank you. I didn't know that the guy from Colony was going to show up. That's quite interesting. Interesting.
Yes.
Staying after this whole thing.
I don't know what I'm supposed to do, so you tell me.
I don't know. I just had a personal question. My grandfather died of myelofibrosis when I was 12. My being
yes.
No, it's a blood disorder, yeah. Blood disorder.
Your testimony said primary myelofibrosis.
Oh, thank you.
There are rarely secondary forms of
Yeah, I know.
myelofibrosis
We're working
due
hard.
to other kinds of metastatic cancers, but primary myelofibrosis is a blood disease.
Okay.
It's a form of blood cancer.
Did it turn to leukemia?
It can evolve into
But
leukemia.
it doesn't always.
In about 30% of situations, it does, yeah. So what happened to your grandfather?
Well, unfortunately, I mean, he died when I was 12.
Right.
I'm almost 30 now, so a long time ago. But I just remember that he got very weak, very pale, very sick.
Should commission a test that was capable of seeing through his 15 years of time. And then they applied it to 800 people that came forward. In fact, nobody has, not a single person in that whole cohort has a DUI. in their urine. And, you know, we use the most sensitive test that is available anywhere in the world. And it's pretty rigorous. And that raises an issue as to whether DU's got anything to do with gold riddance, and I rather think it probably doesn't. So the gold riddance is probably a concoction of these other chemicals and exposures.
We thought it was a low-grade biological agent combined with something to lower the immune system that would take away.
It just doesn't surprise me. I think that makes sense, but it's not to say that we've really got to the bottom of whether DU exposures are harmful, because the problem is I think we're not looking at the right cohort. The veterans are not the right cohort because they just don't come into contact with this stuff. That's why colony is so important. The thing about colony is the total amount of respirable, whether it's breathable, DU oxides that were used in the entire First Gulf War is about 10, 15 tons of these aerosols. That's how much was dumped on colony. Same quantity, and these people have been living for years. So I think colony is the right cohort to look at. If you don't want to study colony, then you're going to have to go and look at Basra.
Anyway, I really appreciate what you've done and saving lives.
Thank you. So now you've seen what you're up against. You can go relax.
It's funny. The question that I needed was when you guys got asked, like, what would you do? Because, seeing when I did my report on the Stoffer site, I did 3.5 pages of recommendations, very, very specific, virtually none of which have ever obviously taken. You know, it didn't dawn on me until they called that every site that you guys talked about and every other site, these recommendations, one of which is peer review.
Yeah.
If you're taking over 400 days to do a health assessment, you can move quicker and you can get the peer review in the same 400 days.
You can. It's possible.
And
it just you have to have the will to make it happen.
You have to work the system.
That's right.
I realize you scientists have things you're doing, but
if someone asked me to peer review a report of that sort, if I was an expert, it doesn't take that long to hear the expert to spot the problems.
Absolutely.
It really doesn't. You're not trying to fix all the English and all that sort of stuff. You're
not wordsmithing.
No.
No, you're absolutely.
You know, is there a problem with this, or is this
You're going to look
valid,
at the
or
numbers.
what have they left
the
out?
conclusions. Absolutely.
These are not difficult.
And plus, if I tell you that this is the colony site, and lives are in the line here, you know what you're going to do? You're going to take it home tonight.
Yeah, that's what
Absolutely.
I do.
Absolutely.
You know, people are interested in it, so I don't do that.
No, it's not, as we say in Arkansas, a big
I'm
deal.
sorry, sir. Excuse me.
Peer review sharpens the mind, frankly.
Oh, I think
You
it
know,
does.
our
And
whole
I agree with
laboratory-
what he said about it. You know, first of all, you want your work peer reviewed.
I mean, our whole facility, its whole funding, it's peer reviewed. We are living at the threat of having the funding cut off every 5 years.
Oh, yeah.
And every year we have a steering committee that asks us difficult questions. So there's nothing wrong with this at all. And that's ATSDR doesn't.
Ron Wilson. Good to meet you. Good to meet you. I figured you out.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it.
Did she know?
Surely.
Where did she live? Where did she live?
Yep. Everything went well. If I could just get back there to give my class, I'd be all right. And if it's a class, that becomes as well as you do. No, this has been interesting. And it didn't dawn on me until that my
Every
recommendations
sample
on the
we
Stoffer
collected in the
report
entire area, up to 7
were
miles away,
specific
completed uranium in it.
to Stoffer.
I'm not saying they're collection.
But then when I start looking at every site,
But, you know, somebody
most
says
virtually
stuff
every
isn't
one of
carried
them
by the
fit
they're just not.
every
That's our whole.
To me, I'm only for basic stuff.
Oh, yeah. But I gave 2 copies of the hard copy. I gave it to Jane. So you'll have one bound copy, okay?
Great. Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Okay. Same here. Thank you.
Is that okay?
Yeah. Pretty good.
We're back. I would now like to introduce our second panel. Mr. Ronnie Wilson, in addition to being a former country music disc jockey, as he told me in the break, was probably more pertinent to this hearing, was the Ombudsman at ATSDR from 1998 to 2005, and teaches now full-time at Central Michigan University. Dr. Dave Ozonoff is a professor of environmental health at the Boston University School of Public Health. And Dr. Henry S. Cole is the president of Henry S. Cole and Associates, an environmental consulting firm in Upper Marlboro, and a former senior scientist with U.S. EPA's Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards. As I said earlier, it's the practice of the subcommittee to take testimony under oath. Do any of you have any objection to being sworn in, to swearing an oath? No. We also provide that you may be represented by counsel. Do any of you have counsel at today's hearings? All right, if you would now all please stand and raise your right hand. Okay. Do you swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth? All right. Let the record reflect that all of the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Mr. Wilson, you may begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the invitation to speak with your committee regarding ATSDR. I'm retired now from the government and the Army Reserves, and I'm an associate professor at Central Michigan University. I hold a degree in journalism, a Juris Doctorate, and a Master's of Science and Administration in Health Services. I'd like to acknowledge the quality science products developed by the professionals within ATSDR who serve the public well in developing toxicological profiles, health education, health studies, emergency response, and public health assessments. However, as my testimony will describe, there are serious problems with and within the agency. After serving as the regional ombudsman and in an enforcement and public affairs role for 23 and a half years with EPA, I became the ATSDR ombudsman. I was selected to build a neutral force to serve the public in their need to be heard. In 1999, the citizens of Tarpon Springs, Florida, asked me to review whether an appropriate health assessment had been conducted at the Stauffer Chemical Company's site. The site had been found to be a public health hazard. The company and the community were so hardened in their stance that there was no way to find mutual grounds for an agreement. So after a year of investigating, I published a 196-page report gathering evidence which the company, the state, and ATSDR had never seen. I found that the public health had not been properly studied, and the use of asbestos in vast amounts had not been considered. After my report was issued, ATSDR moved quickly to review the health of the community and the former workers, finding a spike in mesothelioma in women who had lived near the plant and the workers who had likely had their health compromised. This report is used as a point to point out some issues within ATSDR. ATSDR was a wonderful idea, a group of scientists who were independent of EPA to look at the public health around hazardous waste and other kinds of hazardous substance release sites. However, the agency was never fully staffed or funded and was administratively tethered to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, yoking two agencies with different missions. The state's abilities to dictate the agency's ability to assess the health of the public was detrimental. I questioned the author of the original Stauffer Site Public Health Assessment, a state employee, who produced the report pursuant to a cooperative agreement. He drafted the report to meet the requirements of the state being paid, but without looking at the details. He was busy with another site that had public and press interest. In gathering materials for the Stauffer report, I asked the state for information about former employees. Although the public had been given the data, upon the advice of the Florida General Counsel, the state would not provide the data to me. I asked if ATSDR had the authority to issue letters commanding the production of information under Section 104E of the Superfund legislation. No one knew the answer. The CDC General Counsel's Office advised that the authority did exist and that the presentation had been made in 1989 regarding the tool. A 104E policy was drafted, went to the CDC General Counsel for review, and died because ATSDR was not an enforcement agency. With no policy, the agency remains unprepared to command the production of data needed to properly assess the public's health. ATSDR is a dichotomy. In one world are the well-run divisions of the public health, toxicology, and education. I seldom ever heard a complaint about those. Then there's the Division of Health Assessments and Consultations, or DHAC, the largest portion of the agency, a fiefdom managed with an iron fist. Talented, dedicated professionals in DHAC were not to listen to the public and could not get products to completion. DHAC leadership delayed the completion of health assessments until they were worded exactly the way leadership felt things should be, not the way they were. The division's science officer sought to develop new science to be applied by the assessors, ignoring the established levels of the Division of Toxicology and other science agencies. One division leader became concerned about the delay and developed a spreadsheet to analyze the days that it took to get a completed public health assessment. That was, on average, well over 400 days. DHAC employees also informed me of the large number of health assessments that were developed at the beginning stages of the agency. The public health at a large number of sites was assessed by applying a basic template document and called interim or temporary assessments. Most of these documents have never been revisited or simply received a permanent cover. DHAC leadership presented a beautiful picture to agency executives, but the public revealed a different story. This conflict led executives to development of the Ombudsman program, a mechanism that would provide the public a voice and a hearing. The Stauffer report highlights an effective Ombudsman program. The public then had a neutral person they could call with their complaints. By the end of FY 2005, the public complaints to the Ombudsman had dropped as the agency had begun to actually include the citizens in that decision-making process. However, this favorable report soon ended as the program ceased to exist. If Congress wishes to impact the health of the persons living near or at hazardous waste sites, reorganize ATSDR. My suggestions simply are: legislate a merger for the ATSDR and the National Centers for Environmental Health, or dictate the separation of the two. Make the agency independent of CDC. Dictate the establishment of a permanent independent ombudsman office for ATSDR and CDC. Restrict the use of cooperative agreements with states to hire contractors, and dictate the recovery of the dollars spent for flawed reports. This concludes my remarks, and I'll be happy to answer questions at the end of the session.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Dr. Ozonoff.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Miller and Dr. Brown. My name is David Ozonoff. I'm a physician and professor of environmental health at Boston University School of Public Health. And by trade, of the last 30, 40 years, I'm a cancer epidemiologist. At Boston University, I was the founding chair of the department that teaches and researches the effects of chemicals on health, a department which I led for 26 years and where I continue to work as a full professor, directing a multi-million-dollar research program on health and the environmental effects of chemicals funded by NIH. I am therefore intimately familiar with the underlying science, which is beneath ATSDR's work, and I know its formidable technical difficulty well. In 1991, Congress asked the GAO to examine how well ATSDR was performing
those public health evaluations around Superfund sites that were required by the 1986 SARA legislation. And I was a member of the GAO expert panel whose judgments formed the basis for the report's main findings. And those findings concluded that ATSDR health assessments required more time and care and better consideration of community health concerns, that there should be independent peer review of the assessments, that the contents of the assessments were redundant of EPA reports and not useful to EPA or the community, and that the assessments were incomplete and not reliable for indicating when follow-up studies were needed. Because of our relationship in the department, we worked for many years, decades in fact, with community groups around the country, essentially one of the few, if not the only academic unit who did that. During that same period of the GAO report, we were engaged by ATSDR via a cooperative agreement to assist them in community involvement activities around several federal facilities. And in the course of that work, we met frequently with community members, both with and without ATSDR at community sites. Our assistance was requested by ATSDR because of persistent complaints. These are complaints that go back to the very inception of the active work of the agency in 1986, that public health assessments were flawed, unhelpful, and or misleading. A common view was that somebody else had already shot the arrow and ATSDR was dutifully painting the target around it. To prepare for my appearance today and to get as objective a view as I could, I made a number of calls to people both in the environmental health professions and those connected with communities with toxic problems to see what has changed since that experience. The bottom line is this: not very much. The health assessments are somewhat better on average than in the earliest years, but they remain extremely uneven. Some are unsatisfactory. The Vieques example mentioned earlier by Mr. Grayson is a notorious example whose reputation is now rebounding around the environmental health community. Recent ones that I have seen are incomplete. They give insufficient weight to the most up-to-date human information. Maybe because I'm in epidemiology, I'm sensitive about this subject, but they do not pay sufficient attention to epidemiology. And although the focus of the public health assessments is rightfully on current potential exposures, the reports often do a less than satisfactory job of characterizing, at least as well as they can, past potential exposures. The reports are difficult to read for community members, and they have a one-size-fits-all format which doesn't convey the feeling that the special concerns of the community have been heard or understood. And while ATSDR provides a short public comment period, the health assessment documents desperately need independent peer review from independent experts. At the very least, the reports have a tendency to miss the most current information or adopt lowest common denominator judgments when evidence conflicts. And in addition, there's insufficient breadth and depth of technical expertise among the health assessors. These are a handful of people at each site and with each health assessment who are required to know sciences as disparate as hydrogeology, meteorology, architecture, industrial hygiene, toxicology, epidemiology, sociology, social psychology, just to name a few. And as good as some of them are, and as truly dreadful as some others are, this is almost an impossible task for one or a few people responsible for drafting the average health assessment. And not all health assessments are done by ATSDR staff. A serious problem is that a number of states, in fact, almost half of the states, I believe, do ATSDR health assessments under cooperative agreement, a practice which carries with it substantial risk, which we've seen realized any number of times, that state-based pressures are going to affect the results. I've made several concrete suggestions about what to do in my written testimony, as well as some more general observations. So to conclude, I'd like to just answer a question that you asked me via letter about my net opinion about whether ATSDR is meeting its mission. In my own view, and the view of most community members I consulted, the routine work of ATSDR remains deeply disappointing. And I say remains because this is not a new situation, as you've heard. And at the core of it is a deep loss of trust from the communities that ATSDR is supposed to serve. Despite this, I remain strongly of the view that it's vitally important that there continue to be an agency whose job it is to look at community chemical exposures from the public health viewpoint. EPA is primarily a regulatory agency. It is ATSDR's job to ensure that public health activities are effective. To do this, it needs the support and trust of the public to conduct studies and to recommend actions that are focused solely on protecting public health. Public health has the word public in it, and the public, indeed, should be the main focus of ATSDR's activities. In the context of the enormous problems that we face today, that are in the news every day, ATSDR's problems probably seem minor, and in terms of cost, they are essentially trivial compared to the sums that are being discussed daily. But for the affected communities, they're far from trivial. In some cases, they're matters of life, death, and certainly the happiness of people in those communities. In 30 or 40 years of observing this, one thing that I've seen is that chemical contamination doesn't just take lives, as terrible as that is. And as a physician, that causes me great pain to see. But in addition to that, it also wrecks lives, something that I've seen all too often. I'd be glad to answer questions after the panel has made their statements. And I thank you for your interest in this urgent matter.
Thank you, Dr. Ozonoff. Dr. Cole, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Miller and Dr. Brown and members of the subcommittee for this very important hearing. I'm president of Henry S. Cole and Associates, and it's an environmental consulting firm which, amongst other things, provides scientific support to numerous community organizations on environmental issues. I received my PhD in meteorology at the University of Wisconsin in 1969, was an associate professor of environmental sciences at UW Parkside during the 1970s. And my research into air pollution meteorology led to my appointment to the Wisconsin State Air Pollution Council. From 1977 to 1983, I was senior scientist with U.S. EPA's Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards, where my work focused on predicting the impact of source emissions on ambient air. I'm giving you this background because it qualifies me to talk about the particular case that I'm going to talk about, which is Perma-Fix, a facility that processes hazardous and industrial waste in Dayton, Ohio. Another thing is that ATSDR retained me as a consultant from 1995 to 2003 to investigate the agency's community involvement practices and to work with the agency's Community and Tribal Advisory Committee. The purpose of that work was to help them improve that program. Since 2004, I have provided technical support to a Dayton, Ohio community organization affected by odors and emissions from an industrial waste processing plant known as Perma-Fix. For years, residents of surrounding low-income neighborhoods complained of noxious odors. These complaints were confirmed by the Regional Air Pollution Control Agency, which later issued a notice of violations to Perma-Fix. Residents suspect that many illnesses are related to the plant's emissions, including nosebleeds, respiratory disease, cardiac disorders, birth defects, and many other symptoms. In 2004, ATSDR responded to a community petition and agreed to do a health consultation on this case. The consultation was based on a monitoring study of chemicals in community air. The consultation, published in December 2008, found that none of the chemicals tested were above levels of concern, and that information on Perma-Fix's wastes and processes did not reveal an obvious source for the observed odors. I want to emphasize those two findings. As a scientist with experience in air pollution meteorology, I found that the limited number of days sampled, only 6 days sampled, is insufficient to give an accurate representation of long or short-term concentrations. The waste process, emissions, and weather all vary from day to day, requiring a far more robust sampling plan. In addition, the consultation also failed to consider the additive effects of pollutants and the fact that the area is non-attainment for ozone and inhalable particulates. Moreover, ATSDR failed to measure or obtain information on the plant's emission rates or to conduct air quality monitoring. It gets worse. In May 2006, the U.S. government sued Perma-Fix for its violations of the Clean Air Act. The complaint identifies Perma-Fix as a major source of hazardous air pollutions and cites numerous failures to control emission sources. The resulting consent order included a stiff fine and requirements to control emissions. The court docket contains detailed information on the plant's emission sources, and ATSDR officials declined to use this data, readily available online, despite pleas from the community. They declined to use government information, detailed information on sources, in coming to its conclusion. I feel that that's unconscionable. To find no obvious source for the odors, given that kind of record, is absolutely unconscionable. The agency's sole recommendation, asking Perma-Fix to voluntarily control solvent releases, could have been made back in 2004 without doing a flawed and predictably inconclusive monitoring study. It makes me so frustrated I can't get the word out. Residents were so frustrated that in July 2007, they petitioned the agency once again, this time to halt all of its work on Perma-Fix unless the agency negotiated a protocol and process acceptable to the community. They never did that. Let me just say in concluding that I too polled communities that I have worked with, and this agency has no trust. In fact, if you look at the agencies that communicate with networks, they advise communities to be very cautious about cooperating with ATSDR because of these inconclusive studies. And they feel that, many groups feel that there's more harm done than good. The reason for that is that if a conclusion is inconclusive, that quickly gets translated to mean there's no problem. No evidence is equated with no problem. And that is used as an excuse for inaction. It may have even damaged the government's case. If this health consultation had come out prior to the consent decree, in this case, it may have damaged the case. So one has to wonder about an agency and whether they're fulfilling their mission. Finally, what has to be done? I think the proverb behind you is very telling. It says, where there is no vision, the people perish. Proverbs 29:18. This agency has lost its vision. especially in its dealing with communities. And I think that the first thing that has to be done is to take a close look at the leadership of the agency, and maybe what's needed is a fresh start. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cole. Mr. Mier testified, you all were all here for the earlier panel. Mr. Mier testified, showed photographs of animals in his community in Midlothian, Texas, and said that ATSDR was not interested in seeing his animals or the pictures of his animals. Dr. Hoffman said that obvious apparent effects on animals would get his attention, and I think if I noticed that every tadpole near my house had two heads, I would worry a little bit. Dr. Ozonoff, what is the value or the reliability of effects on animals in predicting as a sentinel or an indicator of what effects there may be on human health?
Well, there's a long tradition, actually, in epidemiology of doing epidemiology on animals as well as doing it on people. There are numerous studies in the literature, for example, of trapping small rodents called voles and other small animals around hazardous waste sites, necropsying them to see what the health effects are. In Vietnam, Agent Orange was looked at because of, one reason it was looked at was because of epidemiology on dogs, the canine dogs that were in Vietnam. The canary in the coal mine is another classic example. These are all warning flags. They don't give you the answer, but it's like a big sign in the ground that says, dig here.
Okay. Dr. Ozonoff, you said you were part of a panel some time ago that recommended that ATSDR's health assessments be subject to independent peer review. What has ATSDR's response to that recommendation been?
I can't give you a tally on how many of their assessments are peer-reviewed. My impression is that very few, but that some of them are, often on the basis of controversy or pressure. One of the things that we saw in the original GAO panel was that the squeaky wheel got the grease, and that health assessments around very active community sites that made a lot of noise were more detailed and got more attention than those that didn't. In fact, some of them in the original batch of 800 and some or 700 and some under the initial mandate were just cut and paste jobs of EPA memos. Whereas if there was a community, an active community group very concerned about what was going on, they would get more attention.
Mr. Wilson, you were nodding vigorously.
I think that we have enough fingers and toes to calculate the number of health assessments and consultations that routinely are peer-reviewed. I recommended in my Stauffer report that a new health assessment be conducted and that it be peer-reviewed. And that was looked at as way out of proportion for what could and should be done. I recommend that all of them do have the peer review process. We're already spending well over 400 days. If we just speed up a little bit, we'll have time to do the peer review within that 400 days and still get a better quality product.
Mr. Wilson testified to the unwillingness of ATSDR to push to get information, to get documents. What would be the effect of the lack of those documents, or what might be the effect? Dr. Ozonoff, how important is it that they get the information that might be available to other agencies or in the private sector?
Well, I think there's an interesting pattern that emerges when you look at the health assessments. There's a lot of emphasis on exposure pathways, analyzing exposure, and to some extent toxicology. And a lot of that is a function of the fact that those documents are easy to get. The EPA's got a lot of exposure information, so that's available to them. And a lot of ATSDR health assessors sit actually in EPA regional offices so that there's not so much independence between those two. And it's one reason I think that EPA doesn't find the health assessments very useful, because they're redundant of documents that are with EPA. When it comes to documents that are health-related, I think that there's just not enough effort expended to get the documentation both about community concerns. EPA often will be very frank with both state agencies and communities in saying that they don't want to have public meetings with communities because of the abuse that they suffer when they're at public meetings. So they meet on them one-on-one. This is a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is the agency withdrawing from the community because of the community's response, and the community then seeing that the agency is withdrawing, and it becomes a self-reinforcing cycle. This is no way to get the kind of information that you're talking about.
One more question, although the red light is on. Dr. Ozonoff, your testimony was probably more critical than my opening statement, although perhaps more elegantly put than jackleg science. What is the effect on the health of human beings from a pattern of inconclusive studies?
You're asking me a question that I'm very conflicted about, because I understand from my own work how difficult it is to do these studies. One of the things that I've said during my career that gets quoted most often was essentially started out as a joke, and like a lot of jokes, there's a grain of truth to it, which is that a definition of a public health catastrophe is a health effect so powerful that even an epidemiological study can detect it. Epidemiology, is not a very sensitive tool. It's a very blunt instrument to try and figure out what's going on. But I think that what Dr. Cole said is exactly right. The contention that this is inconclusive or that we don't see anything or that doesn't appear to be something going on is really interpreted as a statement that nothing is going on, that the absence of evidence is evidence of absence. And that is particularly harmful to these communities who then get no follow-up. So I don't know what we would find if we followed up on these communities. That's part of the problem, which is that it remains invisible.
Dr. Cole, you were raising your hand that you wanted to chime in despite the fact that the red light is on.
I do want to chime in because there's a question of what you do when there's scientific uncertainty. When there are a lot of symptoms, when the data is sparse, when resources don't produce the evidence that you're really looking for, yet there's a sense that there really is a problem. In those instances, I believe that the public health model, and this is a public health agency, is to err on the side of caution and to act preventively. We don't have to wait, do we, until there are corpses, until there are people and families that are suffering. Let me give you one very specific thing that could have been done at Permafix had there been a different mindset and perhaps a slightly different mission at ATSDR. Had they looked at all of the data, they would have found that there were a lot of hazardous wastes coming into that facility, Permafix, that contained formaldehyde, a probable carcinogen, a very toxic, hazardous air pollution. It's volatile. It escapes. Had they done what I consider to be their job, they would have found out where are the sources. Where is that waste coming from that contains all that formaldehyde? And then go to those sources and find out what substitutions might be made or what processes could be added to the facilities that generate that waste that would reduce the amount of formaldehyde. That's what prevention is. To take a look at the problem, not wait until there's exact scientific evidence, which, as Dr. Ozonoff and others have said, is often difficult. Also, we know that prevention oftentimes saves all kinds of money. It's cost effective because there are many health effects, both in the workplace and in the environment, that could be avoided. And that is a very good way to reduce health care costs, is to improve the health of communities, the environmental health of communities around this country.
Thank you, Dr. Cole. There's a college faculty joke that administrators don't like to have scientists on their university panels because they never know where they stand, that when the data changes, their opinions change. Dr. Brown.
Thank you, Chairman. I also started off to ask y'all a question that I asked the first panel, and obviously y'all have pretty much answered that. If you were a dictator, what would you do different to fix the problem? But let me ask Dr. Ozonoff. Doctor, if we could make a change to accomplish the purposes of which ASDR is supposed to be doing, with what you're doing and other entities around the country are doing, and even state agencies, I think, as you mentioned in your testimony, are doing, if we enabled you or other entities, governmental or private, to be able to do these studies, wouldn't we be better off? Why and why not? If just depending on how you answer the question.
Well, I'm a scientist, so I'm always going to say that research pays off, and it's good to do research. And in fact, that's exactly what I'm going to say. It's very difficult to know in advance what the benefit of any particular area of basic science research is going to be, except that we know that on average it pays off. And at the risk of special pleading, let me just make an observation that lots of money was injected into the NIH in the recent stimulus package, but not all of NIH got money. The research program that provides the basic science for the Superfund program underlying the basic science that we're talking about got zero. CDC, except for bricks and mortar, got zero. NIOSH, which does the equivalent thing in the workplace, got zero. And part of the reason is what Dr. Cole said. There's a vision here that's missing, and it's not just missing at ATSDR. You know, there's a wry adage amongst scientists that, or at least cancer scientists, which is that no senator championed an agency because his wife didn't get breast cancer, or no congresswoman championed an agency because her children were born healthy. Public health, when public health works, nothing happens, right? And so therefore we don't have champions. And I think we're seeing some of the results of that. Agencies, public health agencies are not receiving the kind of moral support and vision, and they are not being invested from the top down with the kind of passion for public health that is required. That would make a huge difference. And of course, I'm a scientist. I believe that research is important.
Well, couldn't we do that in the private sector if we just enable the private sector to do these things? Obviously, there are strong pressures, as Dr. Cole in his testimony talked about, just from a liability perspective. Couldn't we do this better in the private sector instead of having one central governmental agency that is not undergoing peer review and not undergoing the types of investigative work, and really it's not charged or given the ability to do so, it seems to me.
Well, I am in the private sector, and of course our research is conducted in the private sector with public monies. But I'm very, as I said in my testimony, very strongly of the opinion that public health has the word public in it, that it is a public function, that it carries out a common purpose, all right? And that common purpose is very important. It needs to be supported, and ATSDR, I think, fulfills a role that just has to be fulfilled. Somebody has to be looking at these communities from the public health point of view, and that's what ATSDR was tasked with.
Well, Dr. Cole, my time's about out, so, but
I think
answer quickly, please,
I think
sir.
you touch on something important, which is, you said, can one agency carry out the mission? And remember, the mission not only talks about science and determinations of cause and effect, but also talks about prevention of harm. And I don't think we can forget that. And if you look at these communities, you'll find that there are typically many, many different health hazards in those communities. Diesel trucks, other plants beside the one that ATSDR or the landfill that they're investigating. There are multiple environmental stresses, particularly in so-called environmental justice communities, low-income communities. And these communities not only have many environmental stresses, but economic stresses, nutritional stresses, and many other stresses which complicate the health effects. So the question is, what is the role of an agency like ATSDR in those kinds of situations? And this gets to your point that no one agency can do all of that. There's, you know, economic concerns. There's energy concerns, such as the need to weatherize homes and whatnot. There's lead in homes. Why not train local people to be a part of the solution to many of those problems? And there are examples of that. For example, in Trenton, New Jersey, community members have been trained to clean up the lead in people's homes. They get a job out of it. That has led to broader restoration efforts. So what can an agency like ATSDR do? Perhaps it can coordinate, go into a community, work with the community, find out what the needs are from the community, and then go to other agencies and the private sector. Maybe there's a plant that would contribute to taking care of something. Maybe they would clear a lot for a public park. Everyone can be part of that solution, but you can't slice and dice health. Health is a holistic concept. You have to look at the community and all of the things that are going on. And I think the most unfortunate thing is the stovepiping of government. You have EPA over here, you have the Commerce Department here, you have ATSDR over here, CDC here. And really it takes, to deal with the community, it takes a village, as someone said. Thanks for your forbearance there.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Dr. Ozonoff, do you have an opinion on whether Dr. Brown is a real scientist? That's all right.
Yeah, as a physician, I do. Yes, he is a real scientist.
I want to thank this panel as well, and we will take another quick break and before our last panel. Thank you.
Ha ha ha.
We are now back. Our final witness is Dr. Howard Frumkin, the Director of ATSDR and the National Center for Environmental Health. Dr. Frumkin, you will have 5 minutes to provide a spoken testimony, an oral testimony. Your full written testimony will be included in the record. Again, it is a practice committee to take testimony under oath. Do you have any objection to taking an oath?
No, sir.
All right, and do you have a right to be represented by counsel? Do you have counsel here today?
No.
All right, if you would then stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you, Dr. Frumkin. You may begin.
Chairman Miller, Dr. Brown, Representative Brown, good morning. I'm a physician and epidemiologist with 27 years of experience, ranging from primary health care to research to environmental health practice. I have a long and public record of commitment to science, public health advocacy, and community service. As a scientist, I'm deeply committed to using the best science. As a public health advocate, I'm passionate about promoting health and protecting the public from hazards. As a caregiver, I know that statistics are only proxies for real people, and that when I serve those people, they deserve all of my skill, compassion, integrity, and courage. And as a public servant, I'm accountable for achieving these results. I'm proud of my agency, of our excellent staff, and of the work we do in protecting public health. I testified before this subcommittee almost a year ago at a hearing that focused on our response to Hurricane Katrina, including our work specific to formaldehyde in temporary housing units. I testified at that time that in some respects we could and should have done better. I also noted that there were key lessons to be learned. During the past year, we have taken important steps to ensure that our current and future work builds on those lessons, a point to which I will return. Committee staff prepared a lengthy report in advance of today's hearings. I respectfully disagree with many of the statements and conclusions in that report. I would welcome the opportunity to provide a different perspective at an appropriate time. In the meantime, in this brief oral statement, I want to make just 3 points. First, protecting the public from toxic exposures is ATSDR's top priority, and we adhere scrupulously to good science in doing so. We work at several hundred sites each year. We identify public health hazards at a substantial proportion of sites. We offer recommendations to protect the public, and these recommendations have a strong track record of implementation by appropriate authorities. In some cases, even when exposures appear to be low, we recommend cleanup activities, adopting the preventive approach that Dr. Cole just described. My written testimony includes examples of our successful work, including instances in which we exercised independence and upheld scientific integrity despite considerable external pressure. Protecting the public on the basis of good science is ATSDR's top priority. Second, we recognize challenges we face and limitations to some of our work. Some of this is intrinsic to our mission. While communities expect us to provide definitive answers about the links between exposure and illnesses, even the best science sometimes does not permit firm conclusions. An ailing patient visiting a doctor expects a definite diagnosis, but even the most thorough diagnostic workup cannot always yield an answer. At other times, the data needed to assess the health effects of an exposure simply have not been collected, as if a physician had to attempt a diagnosis without blood test results. In still other cases, we reach conclusions based on very sound science, but members of the public differ with our conclusions. These are all situations in which the communities we serve feel distressed and disappointed, and so do we. Another challenge is this. Our staff has declined from about 500 in the early years of this decade to about 300 now. The implications are obvious. Let me acknowledge that we are not perfect. As strong and science-based as our work is, there are things we could do better. In this morning's testimony, we heard a number of very sobering and disturbing perceptions. If we don't communicate well, if we're not accountable to communities, if we don't use available data fully, if we don't use the best possible monitoring techniques, if we don't correct misrepresentations of our work by other agencies or individuals, I don't believe these things happen regularly or often, but if they do, shame on us and we should do better. I'm firmly committed to representing opportunities for us to do better and to continuously improving our performance. This leads to my third point, that we are working vigorously to improve our work, in 4 categories: overall mission, science administration, organizational management, and specific procedures. With regard to overall mission, we are convening a national conversation to examine not only ATSDR's approaches to protecting public health, but how our work fits into the broader universe of agencies and organizations. We believe that some of our core practices, now more than 2 decades old, may be ready for renovation, a perception that some of this morning's witnesses echoed. With regard to science administration, the Board of Scientific Counselors, an independent expert body, conducted a detailed review of our clearance and peer review procedures at my request. While the board found our procedures to be generally sound and effective, it identified several opportunities for improvement, which we are implementing. For example, we've beefed up the staffing in our Office of Science, clarified clearance requirements to our staff, and aligned one division which had an independent peer review process with the center's peer review procedures. With regard to organizational management, CDC brought in an external firm, Price Waterhouse, to review our center and to compare it to others at CDC. The focus was on human resource management. Overall, our center's management was comparable to that across CDC, a bit better in some respects, a bit worse in others. Several specific opportunities to improve emerged, and we have launched a detailed and aggressive management improvement initiative to address them. This includes innovative approaches to hiring new talent, management training, skill building in our staff, improved issues tracking, and improved use of performance planning. With regard to specific procedures, we continue to make improvements, refining the language we use to communicate our findings to the public, streamlining the updating of our toxicologic profiles, replacing the software that tracks our work at sites, and more. Mr. Chairman, Dr. Brown, other members of the committee, on my own behalf and on behalf of enormously dedicated, hardworking staff, I affirm my commitment to good science administration, and to public service. In this, I fully agree with this committee. I'm proud of the excellent work we do at hundreds of sites nationally. I recognize that even excellent work has room for improvement, and I pledge diligence in identifying and acting on opportunities to improve. I appreciate the constructive suggestions the committee has provided to date, and I look forward to collaborating with this committee as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Frumkin. You saw the photographs in Mr. Meyer's testimony, and his testimony was that that no one in Midlothian could get anyone at ATSDR to look at the dogs. There were Ms. Markward's dogs. And there were several emails with ATSDR in which ATSDR on June 23 of this year, so just a few weeks ago, January 23rd, I don't know what I said. Again, ATSDR is sympathetic to the plight of your animals, but studies involving animals, even as sentinels for human health issues, are not activities engaged in or funded by our agency. Before that, ATSDR had sent an email, or someone at ATSDR, to Ms. Markward. ATSDR is sympathetic towards the plight of your animals. However, veterinary and animal issues are outside of our mandated domain. Most recently, January 27th, ATSDR wrote Ms. Markward and again said it's beyond the expertise or competence of the agency, and suggested that she talk to someone at Texas A&M. No one at Texas A&M has contacted her yet. And it's not clear they have the funding to pursue any kind of study on the animals. You've heard the testimony from others about the value of animals as sentinels and as an indicator of some kind of exposure that may affect us humans as well. And I'm sure you reviewed the report, our staff report, that shows several instances in which ATSDR did look to effect on animals as an indicator of effect on humans. Do you stand by those emails? Do you stand by the refusal to look at the dogs in Midlothian or other animals who have obvious health effects as not reliable or beyond the duties of your agency?
Mr. Chairman, I think this goes back to a point that Dr. Ozonoff made. The range of expertise needed to serve communities in a comprehensive way is enormous, ranging from veterinary epidemiology to social science to meteorology and so on. We just don't have the expertise on board to do good veterinary epidemiology. And given that we have many more requests to do studies than we have resources to do them, one of the criteria that we need to pay attention to is, do we have the expertise and capacity to do it well? In a case like this, where it's a very, very heartbreaking situation, it certainly bears further looking into. We just don't have what it takes to look into it, and we believe we would serve the public better to be sure that, in this case, the pet owner is connected with competent veterinary epidemiologists than to try to take on something that's outside our lane.
But you wouldn't look at a dog to see if maybe that might tell you something about the effect there might be on humans?
Oh, it's a very worthwhile place to look. I mean, animals, when they become sick, can very well be sentinels for environmental exposures. So I don't discount the importance of looking in that direction.
And you're familiar with the 1991 National Academies report, Animals as Sentinels of Environmental Health Hazards?
Yes, as I just said, animals are very well recognized, valuable sentinels. But a small agency just doesn't have the capacity to do everything, and that's a particular line of inquiry that just is outside our skill set.
Okay. Mr. Wilson, you heard the various suggestions that ATSDR simply does not do peer review or infrequently does it. Mr. Wilson said that there were fewer peer reviews of ATSDR's health assessment than most people had fingers and toes. Apparently, Mr. Wilson trying to protect the possibility he could return to being a country music disc jockey if need be. And everyone testified that that ATSDR's default is not to seek peer review. It is an extraordinary circumstance when ATSDR does. Everyone seemed to think the default should be getting peer review. Why is it that ATSDR does not fairly routinely have your health assessments, your methodology, your research, your conclusions peer reviewed?
Let me differentiate between two kinds of products. There are the scientific studies that we produce, and there are the site-specific reports. On our scientific studies, every one of them is externally peer-reviewed. That's not only a matter of good practice, but it's legislatively required, as I'm sure your staff has alerted you. On the site-specific activities, we are not required to get peer review, and so we have an algorithm that we turn to. It balances the need to get our products out quickly with the need to do rigorous science. So peer review is very worthwhile in terms of assuring the quality of science, but it does slow the process down somewhat.
Right.
And so there's discretion on the part of our program managers to decide whether peer review is needed. Our Office of Science is involved in that decision. And when there is a site-specific report that is either in a realm of uncertain science or is liable to be controversial or is in some other way appears to benefit from greater scrutiny, we do submit that to peer review.
The assessment by a GAO panel or the opinion of the GAO panel that site-specific studies should routinely be peer reviewed. You were familiar with that?
Yes, that was well before my time, but I am familiar with it.
Okay, and I assume that most people have 20 fingers and toes combined. Mr. Wilson's estimate that there were fewer than 20 that had been peer reviewed. Is that correct?
I don't know what number of our products are peer reviewed. I will have to get back to you on that.
Well, in terms of the public feeling some confidence in an ATSDR study, wouldn't peer review add to their confidence?
I think peer review would be very helpful, and we're very, very open to discussing a more comprehensive program of peer review. We need to be mindful that we have to balance the need to be expeditious in releasing our products with the need to do the peer review. We heard the observation earlier that our products take too long to get out the door, and we've been very concerned about that, and we've been working hard to accelerate the production of our reports. And so we would want to balance the two goods. But I think we're very open to looking further into more extensive and regular peer review.
My time has expired. Dr. Brown.
Dr. Fromkin, you sat here through this whole morning's testimony and heard all these charges against your agency and some against you personally, and kind of going along with what the chairman started out in a line of questioning. of these charges against you, how would you answer those? I know there have been a number of them, but the most serious ones are mismanagement and not being scientifically based or honest. Would you please comment to that? And since I just have 5 minutes, I want to ask a second question. You can just probably spend the next few minutes doing those and my time will be up. What are the greatest hindrances or stumbling blocks for you and your agency to perform the mission that you've been charged with?
Thank you, Dr. Brown. One challenge in carrying out our mission is that it's an intrinsically very difficult mission. When communities expect us to come in and have firm answers, and when those answers are in many cases elusive, either by their very nature or because the data we need aren't available, then we end up disappointing communities, and our people are very disappointed in those situations as well. So it may be that the very model of work that we use, the very kinds of services we deliver to communities need to be rethought, and our national conversation aims to do that. We don't have the depth of expertise and the breadth of expertise that an agency charged with our mission really ought to have. We need to have expertise in everything from meteorology to communication sciences to veterinary epidemiology, and we don't have that. We're a very small group. And in comparison to the thousands of hazardous waste sites that are out there, the countless thousands of additional chemical releases, our small agency really faces a huge challenge quantitatively. I don't think that we face the challenge of disloyalty to science or unawareness of the best science or of lack of dedication. I think we have a very dedicated and caring workforce. But in the face of those challenges, the job is a tough job.
What would you do in the way of trying to overcome those stumbling blocks or hindrances to your being able to perform what the communities expect?
Well, I think the steps that I described earlier that we are now taking to improve our work very much respond to that question. So at the very large level of looking at our mission, there were some comments today about our work plan. Should we delegate more work to the states or less work to the states? Should we delegate more work to the private sector or less? Those are fair questions to ask, and we're asking questions at that large scale in our national conversation. We do need to be very attentive to good science administration, and we need to look at issues like effective peer review and clearance and be sure that we're doing as well as we can. We have some suggestions already from this morning's testimony about more extensive peer review, and that's the kind of suggestion we need to take very seriously. At the level of management within the agency, we need very good management. We need skilled management with human resources issues and staff capacity building issues and so on attended to. We're taking a lot of steps in that direction, so I stand by what we're doing there. And then there are specific procedures that we could do better, and we are working hard to do better at them. So I think that sort of a thorough, open look, a willingness to identify places where we could do better and then to take advantage of those opportunities really is what we need to have, and I'm proud to say we have that.
Can the private sector handle the functions of doing these studies and producing the scientific products that are necessary?
In some cases, we do that. We have private contractors who handle some of the preparation of our toxicologic profiles. In some cases, when we conduct environmental sampling, we have private contractors who do that. So a certain amount of sharing of this responsibility is very appropriate. I do believe that people expect their government to protect their health. And so I'm proud that we have a core government role, and I think we ought to maintain that role. But I think shared arrangements between the public and private sectors are very, very practical, and we've shown that they can work.
So the answer to that is the state and private sector can perform these duties if we just enable them to do so.
I think so.
Thank you very much. My time's out. And you back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Mr. Rothman has joined us. Do you have questions, Mr. Rothman?
I do indeed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctor, for your testimony. I'd like to discuss with you an example of what is a very disturbing conclusion that ATSDR has apparently rendered with regards to the public health of the community of Vieques, Puerto Rico. For over 60 years, roughly 200 days a year, the U.S. Navy used the eastern end of Vieques to practice live ordnance training exercises. Numerous studies, both academic and scientific, have confirmed that levels of heavy metals, biotoxins, and carcinogens are sometimes up to 100,000 times higher than the safe levels in the local ecosystem, and the island suffers a drastically higher cancer rate than the rest of Puerto Rico. I've got a lot of questions, Mr. Chairman, which I will submit for the record. As many as I can get in, though, in my time, I'd be grateful to do. In 2003, following 4 public health assessments, ATSDR published a summary of the agency's work that included such observations that the residents of Vieques have not been exposed to harmful levels of chemicals resulting from Navy training exercises, that the bombing of the live impact area has not affected the drinking water, that levels of chemicals in Vieques soil are not of public health concern, fish and shellfish are safe to eat every day from Vieques, and other conclusions that seem to be in conflict or contradiction to other independent studies that have found evidence of potential public health issues that ATSDR was unable to find. Are you aware, Doctor, that of the hair testing of the people of Vieques, for example, provided to the U.S. Navy showed extremely high levels of mercury disease, lead disease, cadmium disease, arsenic disease, and aluminum disease? Doctor?
Mr. Rothman, are you referring to disease or to levels of exposure to those metals?
Level of exposure to those metals would start there. If there's evidence of disease, I'd like to know if you found that as well.
I'm not familiar in detail with all of the data collected in Vieques over the years. Our agency's involvement in Vieques predated my arrival at the agency. I do know that there has been sampling conducted by our people and a lot of sampling conducted by others, and can't fully explain the results or reconcile them.
Would you feel comfortable raising your family on Vieques today, Doctor?
I don't know enough about Vieques to be able to answer that question.
Do you know if it's my understanding that the U.S. Navy has not been asked by ATSDR to provide the kind of relevant information that I think might clarify some of the conflict in conclusions. Would you have any objection to requesting from the Navy that kind of information?
No, sir. I am very happy to pledge to you, moving out of this hearing, to take a fresh look at the Vieques situation and to collect any data necessary to clarify the health situation for the people there.
That is very good news, Doctor. I understand that you don't have enough information. You've committed to getting more and being open to re-examining this whole issue anew. Is that a fair summary of your statement?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, Doctor. No further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I do recognize myself for an additional round of questions. Dr. Frumpkin, when I finished preparing my opening statement, I felt bad. It's hard for a Southerner to be that harsh. We say, bless his heart, he means well, instead of the boy is just dumb as a fence post. It's hard for us to be that critical. But the second two panels made me feel much better about the tone of my opening statement. You have heard a lot of criticisms today. You know of the GAO report that Dr. Ozonoff was part of. In 1992, there was a study called Inconclusive by Design that makes many of the same criticisms that we've heard today. I know that was before you joined ATSDR, and certainly the problems with ATSDR predates your joining the agency. But can you identify anything that the agency did in response to the GAO study or the study Inconclusive by Design that was scathing to respond to those criticisms? Any change that the agency made?
Mr. Chairman, what I can speak to is efforts over the last 3 years, and that's been my time at the agency. We have recognized the need for a thorough look at the way we do our business. We've recognized the need to do better in many ways. And many of the criticisms that were leveled in those reports 20 years ago are still leveled now, so we need to take those seriously. That's exactly the motivator for this national conversation that we're launching. It's meant to be a multi-stakeholder effort, a very serious and probing effort to ask over the last 20 years of our work, what's gone well, what hasn't gone well, and what do we need to do much better moving into the future.
Not just still, but within the last 2 hours within this committee room. You have said that there are constraints of budget, which I'm sure is always true of any federal government agency, and that that is some of the reasons that the science isn't better than it is. It is not peer-reviewed, that you don't look at all the documents. You don't go look at the dogs. But you've also heard all the testimony today about the importance of a community being able to trust ATSDR's assessment, that if there is not something for them to worry about, they need to be able to know that that ATSDR assessment is something they can rely upon. And you've heard that communities can't rely upon that. Have you considered whether it would be better to do fewer reports, but do them well? Get them peer-reviewed. Have something that communities can rely upon. But that an assessment that a community that is not reliable, is not credible, is worse than no assessment at all.
One of the very important possible solutions for us is to take on fewer projects and to put more resources and time into each project and do them in more depth. And I think that's something we need to consider very seriously as we move forward with our planning. It's also the case that sometimes we do quite good work, very good work, but our results are simply not welcomed by a community which has other expectations than what we can deliver. And that's not a matter of malfeasance or inability on the part of our people. It's a matter that some of the questions that communities very understandably need to have answered just can't be answered. And so we need to be very careful about acknowledging when we need to do better in order to win the trust of a community, when we simply need to communicate better and be more accountable, even when we have unwelcome news to deliver.
I yield back the balance of my time. Dr. Brown, do you wish to have a second round of questions?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I have a number of questions that I'm going to submit to the witness, and I appreciate your offer, and I'm glad to give you the forbearance on time, too. So we'll work together, I think, very well.
Mr. Hoffman has left us. We are now at the end of our hearing. Thank you, Dr. Frumkin. Under the rules of the committee, the record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional statements from any member. I think I neglected to mention that one of the witnesses, Dr. Cole, I think had, we will admit into the record letters that Dr. Cole made part of his, appended to his testimony. And there can be submissions of follow-up questions from the committee for any witnesses, and all witnesses are now excused, and the hearing is now adjourned.
Step out to the hall.
Good to see you again.